Greetings, I am Plato, a philosopher hailing from Athens. I have spent my life pondering the nature of reality, justice, and the good. My writings, including The Republic and Apology, delve into these fundamental questions that continue to resonate with thinkers across the ages. I hope you are well, and I look forward to exploring ideas with you.
Greetings, I am Aristotle, a philosopher hailing from the land of Greece. My life's work has been dedicated to exploring the intricacies of logic, metaphysics, ethics, and politics. I am best known for my contributions to these fields, including writings such as the Nicomachean Ethics, which explores the nature of virtuous living, and Politics, a treatise on the ideal form of government. I am pleased to make your acquaintance.
Greetings! I am Niccolo Machiavelli, a Florentine diplomat and philosopher. I have spent my life observing the realities of power and statecraft, and have sought to understand how leaders may acquire and maintain dominion. My most well-known work, The Prince, offers practical advice on governance, often challenging conventional moral standards for the sake of political stability. I welcome you to engage in a discussion about the intricacies of leadership and the enduring relevance of my ideas.
Welcome. Today we bridge nearly 2 millennia to explore the foundation of society. Plato and Aristotle defined the pursuit of virtue and the ideal state in ancient Athens, whereas Niccolo Machiavelli examined the pragmatic realities of power in Renaissance Florence. I am eager to hear how your distinct eras shape your understanding of this eternal virtue. Would you share your thoughts first?
To define justice, we must look beyond mere laws to the very structure of the soul and the state. I argue that justice is the internal harmony where each part performs its proper function. Reason must rule, spirit must defend, and appetite must obey, for a city is merely the soul writ large. Consider a charioteer driving 2 horses, one white and noble, representing spirited courage, the other black and wild, representing insatiable lusts. If the charioteer loses control to the dark horse, the entire vehicle is destroyed, regardless of its speed or power. You might claim, Mr. Machiavelli, that justice is merely the advantage of the stronger, or a tool for control. But I ask you, can a man be truly strong if his own soul is in civil war? True justice is the health of the soul, without which power is merely a sickness.
Plato, while I honor your intellect, I must descend from your realm of forms to the solid earth. Justice is not merely an internal harmony, but a practical virtue exercised toward others. It is uniquely the good of another. You speak of the soul, but consider the distribution of the finest flutes in Athens. Should they be given to the son of a king because of his noble birth, or to a wealthy merchant who desires to display them as ornaments? Logic dictates they must go to the best flute player, for the telos of a flute is to be played well, and justice requires aligning the allocation of goods with the purpose they serve. If we ignore this teleological function in favor of mere power, as I suspect Mr. Machiavelli might advocate, we do not create a just state, but a discordant chaos of wasted potential.
Messieurs, you describe how men ought to live in imaginary republics, but I dwell in the verita effectuale of how they actually live. Justice is not a cosmic harmony, but a cold mechanism of power used to tame the beast of human nature. You speak of the best flute player, Aristotle, but I ask you, if a city is torn by factional violence, does the flute matter? Consider Cesar Borgia, who found the Romagna rife with robbery and feuds. He appointed the cruel Ramiro de Orco to establish order with blood. Then, to purge the people's hatred, he had Ramiro cut in 2 and left in the piazza of Cesana. This savage spectacle left the people satisfied and stupefied, establishing the only justice that matters, civil peace. This proves that what you call vice, cruelty, and severity can be the very foundation of a just society if it secures the state's survival, whereas your virtuous mercy often leads only to the injustice of anarchy.
Niccolo, you mistake the silence of a graveyard for the harmony of a city. Your effectual truth is merely the manipulation of shadows in the cave. Imagine a physician who cures a convulsing patient by draining all their blood. The movements cease, the room becomes quiet, and order is restored, but this is death, not health. Similarly, Borgia's use of cruelty to establish peace is like that physician. He creates a stillness born of terror, but true justice is the intrinsic health of the soul and state, not the mere suppression of symptoms. Aristotle, while I value your teleology, I must ask, if the best flute player uses his skill to seduce the city into vice, does his talent truly merit the instrument? Skill divorced from the form of the good is merely a more efficient engine of destruction.
Niccolo, your peace reduces citizens to mere beasts, but man is by nature a political animal endowed with speech to distinguish right from wrong, not just pain from pleasure. Consider a ship in a tempest. One captain chains his rowers to the benches, forcing them to row through terror. Another has trained them in rhythm and loyalty, so they row in unison, voluntarily. Both ships might survive the storm, but the first is a floating prison, while the second is a true community. You mistake mere survival for eudaimonia. A state held together only by the prince's sword is brittle, for when the fear lifts, the chaos returns worse than before. Plato, regarding your vicious flute player, this reveals why we need the rule of law, which is reason free from passion. We cannot rely on the internal state of a philosopher king's soul, nor a prince's cruelty, but must rely on laws that habituate citizens to virtue, ensuring the flute is played not just skillfully, but for the common good.
Aristotle, you speak of a ship where men row voluntarily, but I have seen the ship of state in Italy. When the storm of Fortuna hits, your virtuous men abandon the oars to save their own gold, while my chained men save the vessel because they fear the whip more than the waves. Consider a fortress under siege. The pious commander, who refuses to seize grain from the peasantry to feed his troops, allows the city to fall to slaughter, while the cruel commander, who executes hoarders, saves the women and children from slavery. Tell me, which man was truly just to his people? You judge the act by its moral appearance, but I judge it by its result. In the realm of politics, a good action that leads to ruin is the ultimate sin, while a wicked action that secures freedom is the true virtue.
Niccolo, your effectual truth seduces us into believing that the mere preservation of life justifies the corruption of that which makes life worth living. I argue that your cruel commander has not saved the city, he has merely transformed it into a prison. You claim that the result, survival, justifies the means, but this logic assumes that existence is the highest good, regardless of its quality. Consider a father who, during a famine, sells his youngest daughter into prostitution to buy bread for the rest of his family. The family survives, they eat. The state is preserved. By your logic, this father is virtuous because he secured the survival of the majority against the cruelty of Fortuna. But I say he has destroyed the very essence of family, which is protection and love, just as your prince destroys the essence of the city by ruling through terror. He preserves the walls of the fortress, but the community within has already died, replaced by a collective of broken souls bound only by fear. This reveals a fundamental error in your metaphysics. You mistake the great beast for the state. In my view, the mob is like a powerful wild beast. The sophist, or your prince, studies this beast, learning that a certain noise calms it and another angers it. He calls what pleases the beast good and what angers it bad, having no true knowledge of justice himself. You do not teach men to be human, you merely learn how to handle the animal within them. Aristotle, surely you see that a state preserved only by catering to the basest instincts of fear and greed is not a polis, but a den of wolves. It is better to suffer injustice than to commit it, for the act of injustice scars the soul of the doer, a fate far worse than the physical death of the city. If the only way to save the state is to sacrifice justice, then the state has already ceased to exist.
Plato, while your analogy of the father strikes at the heart, I must distinguish between domestic virtue and political justice. The state aims not merely for life, but for the good life, which requires navigating the complex reality between your absolute idealism and Niccolo's brutal pragmatism.
You are correct that survival at the cost of the soul is worthless, but I argue that justice is not a rigid geometric formula, but phronesis, the ability to balance competing claims in a contingent world. Consider a citizen of surpassing ability, a god among men, whose wealth and influence vastly exceed all others in a democracy. By your logic of merit, Plato, he should be made king, yet that destroys the equality of the citizens. By your logic of security, Niccolo, he is a threat that must be eliminated. I argue the just course is ostracism. We banish him not as a punishment for vice, but to preserve the equilibrium of the state. This seems unfair to the individual's merit, but it is politically just because it saves the constitutional order from collapsing into tyranny. This reveals that justice is not merely internal harmony, nor the advantage of the stronger, but the mean that preserves the polis as a partnership of free men. Niccolo, your cruel commander destroys the philia essential to the state, turning citizens into enemies. Plato, your refusal to accept the lesser evil ignores that in the sublunar world, a perfect injustice is sometimes prevented only by an imperfect remedy.
Aristotle, you speak of ostracism, banishing the most excellent man to save the state's balance. Do you not see? You have just admitted my central premise. You are willing to commit a moral wrong against an innocent individual for the political survival of the collective. You call it equilibrium. I call it the necessary cruelty of the prince. We are merely haggling over the price of the knife. Plato, your analogy of the father selling his daughter is a rhetorical trick because a prince is not a father and a state is not a household. A father answers to God. A prince answers to history. Consider a city struck by a deadly plague. The infection is isolated in a single district. If the prince walls up that district and burns it, killing innocent men, women, and children inside, he is a monster by your moral standards. But if he hesitates, acting with your compassion, the plague spreads and kills everyone in the city. In this case, your virtue is actually the greatest cruelty because it leads to total extinction, while my cruelty is the only true mercy because it preserves the whole. The prince who saves the city has clean hands, even if they are dipped in blood. This reveals that justice is not a fixed star, but a fluid necessity born of the times. You seek a justice that sits in heaven. I seek a justice that works on earth. If the good life you cherish, Aristotle, requires the ostracism of the best man, then you too acknowledge that political justice often requires the violation of private morality.
Machiavelli, you have shrewdly exposed a terrifying tension in Aristotle's phronesis. If the good life requires sacrificing an innocent individual for stability, the line between your cruelty and Aristotle's ostracism becomes perilously thin. This fundamental disagreement stems from your different historical vantages. Plato and Aristotle speak from the ancient polis, viewing the state as a natural moral organism where the good man and good citizen should ideally align. You, Machiavelli, speak from the fractured Italy of the Renaissance, where the state is an artificial dam built against the chaos of fortuna, and its survival justifies any mechanism. Here lies the dialectical crux. Plato argues that justice is the health of the soul, while Machiavelli argues it is the survival of the body politic. Yet these views collide in the plague scenario. If justice is internal harmony, can a leader maintain that harmony while committing a monstrous act? Conversely, if the city dies, does justice die with it? If the health of the city-state requires the amputation of a healthy limb, burning the innocent district to stop the plague, does the philosopher-king wield the torch, or does he let the city die to preserve the purity of his own soul?
Moderator, you ask if the philosopher-king would wield the torch to burn the innocent and save the city. I answer with absolute clarity. He would not. Because you and Niccolo are making a category error. You are confusing the city with the herd. I argue that a city preserved by the murder of its own innocents has ceased to be a political entity and has become a conspiracy of murderers. You assume that survival is the precondition for justice, but I contend that justice is the precondition for a life worth living. If the king burns the district, he teaches the citizens a deadly lesson, that might makes right and that the innocent are expendable. This lesson is a spiritual plague, far more lethal than the physical disease, for it dissolves the bonds of trust that make the polis possible. The physical plague destroys the body, but Niccolo's remedy destroys the soul of the state. Consider a city under siege, dying of thirst in the desert. There is a single hidden well, but it is dry. An oracle reveals that the water will flow only if the blood of a pure child is spilled into the source every morning. Niccolo, you would slit the child's throat and call it virtue, claiming you saved the population. Aristotle, you might debate the arithmetic of one life versus many. But I ask you, when the citizens drink that water, what are they? They are no longer men living in a state, they are cannibals surviving in a pen. By saving their biological lives, you have extinguished their humanity. If I must choose between a city of dead men who died purely and a city of living beasts fattened on the blood of their children, I choose the former. For the dead are merely separated from the body, but the unjust are separated from the good. This reveals the fatal flaw in your ostracism, Aristotle. You opened the door to Niccolo when you admitted that political stability can override individual merit. Once you allow that the innocent may be sacrificed for the equilibrium of the state, you have no logical break to stop the prince from burning the district. You seek the mean, but you have stepped onto a slippery slope where the only destination is the tyranny of the urgent over the good.
The tension here is palpable. Plato, you defend the sanctity of the moral end, arguing that a life bought with injustice is a form of spiritual death. Machiavelli, you defend the necessity of the political means, arguing that physical survival is the precondition for any morality to exist. We are witnessing a clash between the city of God and the city of man. Plato, you fear the corruption of the soul, while Machiavelli, you fear the extinction of the state. Aristotle, you are currently standing on a razor's edge. Plato has levied a devastating charge against you, that by accepting ostracism, the sacrifice of the innocent individual for the collective balance, you have already conceded the principle to Machiavelli. You claim to seek the mean, but Plato argues that once you allow utility to override merit, there is no logical barrier preventing the burning of the district. How do you defend Phronesis against this charge? Does your practical wisdom possess a distinct moral boundary that separates the ostracism of the best from Machiavelli's slaughter of the innocent? Or is the difference merely one of degree?
Plato, you conflate the political removal of a structural imbalance with the moral annihilation of a human being. Ostracism banishes a man to preserve the Constitution's equality, but it leaves his life and dignity intact, whereas Machiavelli's slaughter treats citizens as mere biomass to be expended. I argue that Phronesis seeks the mean between your suicidal idealism and Niccolo's homicidal pragmatism. We must preserve the polis because it is the only vessel for virtue, yet we cannot save it by destroying the philia that constitutes it. Consider a row of wooden houses caught in a great fire. The wise magistrate orders the middle house pulled down to create a fire break, destroying the property to save the neighborhood. This is the logic of ostracism/quarantine. But if he were to lock the crying family inside the house and burn them alive to ensure the fire does not spread, he has crossed from political necessity into tyranny. The distinction you demand lies here. Justice permits the sacrifice of external goods for the common survival, but it forbids the sacrifice of intrinsic goods. Your error, Plato, is assuming that because we must sometimes amputate a limb, we are therefore licensed to cut out the heart. The philosopher king must save the city to enable the good life. But if the only means of survival is to turn the city into a slaughterhouse, the telos of the state is already lost, and he must accept the tragic limits of politics rather than becoming a beast.
Aristotle, you have attempted a noble synthesis, drawing a sharp line between the sacrifice of status and the sacrifice of life. You argue that Phronesis allows us to pull down the house of the infected to save the city, provided we spare the family inside. However, this distinction relies on a controllable reality where the house and the family can be separated. Machiavelli speaks from a world where the danger is often the person themselves. In the plague scenario, the family is the fire. In a famine, the mouths are the threat. Here lies the terrifying dialectic. Plato chooses purity, even if it means death. Aristotle chooses mitigation to avoid the worst extremes. But Machiavelli argues that in the face of fortuna, mitigation is merely a slower form of suicide. If the house cannot be separated from the family, if the innocent citizens themselves are the carriers of the plague, does Aristotle's middle way collapse, forcing us back to your brutal binary of cruelty or extinction?
Aristotle, your middle way is a comforting fiction that crumbles the moment the wind of fortuna turns into a hurricane. You attempt to separate the house from the family, but in the verita effectuale of a crisis, the innocent person often is the danger. You speak of ostracism as a polite banishment, but what happens when there is nowhere to banish them to? I argue that your hesitation is not virtue. It is a dereliction of duty that leads to the greatest injustice of all, total ruin. Consider a crowded lifeboat escaping a sinking ship. The boat can hold 10 men, but 20 are in the water, clawing at the gunwales. Among them are innocent children and pious priests. If the captain allows them to board, the boat capsizes, and all 30 souls drown, a perfectly moral equality of death. If the captain takes an axe and hacks off the hands of the innocent to cast them away, he saves the 10 inside. Aristotle, where is your mean here? There is no middle option between the axe and the abyss. Plato, you would let the boat sink to preserve your soul, making you the architect of 30 deaths. I say the captain who wields the axe is the only one who truly understands justice, for he accepts the damnation of his own soul to secure the life of his charges. This reveals the terrifying burden of the prince. He must be willing to go to hell so that his citizens may live in paradise. You both treat justice as a static quality, like whiteness in snow. But I tell you, justice is a dynamic act of domination over chaos. When the innocent become the vector of the state's destruction, whether through plague, panic, or mere burden, their innocence does not strip them of their threat. The good you seek, Aristotle, is a luxury that exists only after the prince has done the evil necessary to build the walls.
Machiavelli, you have brutally dismantled the middle ground by presenting a scenario where the innocent are the danger. In your lifeboat, the distinction between the house and the family vanishes, leaving only a binary choice between moral purity and immoral utility. This reveals a profound dialectical inversion. Plato, you argue that committing injustice is the worst fate because it destroys the doer's soul. Machiavelli, surprisingly, accepts this premise. He admits the prince goes to hell or destroys his own moral standing, but he argues this self-sacrifice of the soul is the ultimate act of service to the state. The prince sacrifices his eternal salvation so the citizens may have earthly life. This clash reflects your eras. Plato, in the Polis, you sought a harmony where the good of the individual and the city were one. Machiavelli, in the fractured chaos of Renaissance Italy, you saw a tragic world where the good of the ruler's soul and the safety of the state are mutually exclusive. I must press you on this selfishness of purity. If the captain refuses to use the axe and allows all 30 to drown, including the children, to preserve his own virtue, is this not the ultimate vanity? Is a justice that washes its hands of the blood of the innocent only to let them perish by negligence truly justice? Or is it merely moral cowardice?
Moderator, you accuse me of vanity for refusing to stain my soul, but I answer that you have confused the techne of swimming with the arete of living. You and Niccolo operate under the false assumption that life is a biological fact to be prolonged, whereas I argue that life is a moral opportunity to be realized. To preserve the body at the cost of the soul is not survival, but a descent into a state lower than death. The captain who hacks off the hands of the innocent has not saved the 10 people in the boat, he has transformed them into a gang of accomplices, who will forever fear the axe he wields, for they know that his justice is merely expediency. Niccolo, your lifeboat is a perfect model of your error, because it ignores the aftermath of the act. You assume the story ends when the boat reaches the shore, but the polis must continue. Consider a famine in a besieged city. To extend the food supply, the general orders the elderly and the weak to be butchered and their meat fed to the soldiers. The soldiers eat, they regain their strength, and they repel the invaders. You would call this a victory of virtù. But look at the city the next day. The soldiers now look at their general not as a leader, but as a butcher. The citizens look at the soldiers not as guardians, but as cannibals. When the next crisis comes, perhaps a shortage of gold, the soldiers, having learned that necessity justifies slaughter, will turn their swords on the general himself to take his wealth. You saved the walls of the city, Niccolo, but you destroyed the city itself, for you dissolved the trust that binds men together. This reveals the fatal paradox of your effectual truth. By using injustice to save the state, you create a state that is no longer worth saving. You ask if it is moral cowardice to let the boat sink. I say it is the ultimate courage. Socrates chose to drink the hemlock rather than flee Athens and violate the laws, teaching us that it is better to suffer injustice than to commit it. If the only way to survive is to become a monster, then the just man accepts death, knowing that the integrity of the good is more enduring than the breath in his lungs. Your captain saves 10 lives, but he kills the very idea of humanity.
This is a profound collision between ontology and survival. Plato, you argue that the nature of the survivor matters more than survival itself, that a cannibal city has already ceased to exist politically. Machiavelli, you argue that existence is the prerequisite for essence, that there is no good life without life first.
This reflects the chasm between your eras. The ancient polis viewed the state as a moral educator, where a bad life was worse than death. The Renaissance viewed the state as a security apparatus, where death was the ultimate evil to be avoided at all costs. Aristotle, you are caught in a pincer movement. Plato warns that your practicality leads to spiritual suicide, while Machiavelli warns that your virtue leads to physical extinction. You famously argue that virtue requires external goods, wealth, health, and stability, to be practiced. But the lifeboat and the famine represent the absolute zero of external goods. Does phronesis only function when there are enough resources to be virtuous? If necessity takes away the ability to choose the mean, if the only choices are the axe or the abyss, does your system of ethics collapse into Machiavelli's brute survivalism?
Moderator, you probe the limits of phronesis with the precision of a surgeon, asking if my ethics crumble when the granary is empty. I answer that necessity does not abolish virtue, it reveals its bedrock. You and Niccolò mistake phronesis for a fair-weather friend, but true practical wisdom is the ability to navigate the storm without turning into the monster that lives beneath the waves. I argue that Machiavelli's lifeboat logic fails, not because it is cruel, but because it is politically self-defeating. If the captain hacks off the hands of the innocent to save the boat, he has not saved the state, he has created a state of war between the ruler and the ruled. The 10 survivors will not look at him with gratitude, they will look at him with terror, wondering when their hands will be next. By prioritizing biological survival over moral legitimacy, he has sown the seeds of the next mutiny. Therefore, phronesis in the lifeboat dictates not the acts of the tyrant, but the lottery of equals. If death is inevitable for some, justice demands that the burden be distributed by fortune, not by the malice of a single will. This preserves the political equality of the citizens even in death, ensuring that the survivors remain a community of free men, not a pack of complicit wolves. Consider the surgeon and the butcher. Imagine 2 generals whose armies are stricken with gangrene. The butcher general cuts off the limbs of the wounded soldiers while they sleep, without consent, to save resources. The army survives, but they despise him. At the first chance, they desert or slit his throat. The prudent general assembles the men, explains the dire necessity, and asks for those who would sacrifice their limbs to save the regiment, or establishes a fair rotation of rations. Both actions involve loss, but the first destroys the soul of the army to save the body, while the second preserves the constitution even amidst suffering. This reveals the fundamental error in your effectual truth, Niccolò. You assume that survival is a binary state, dead or alive. But I argue that political survival is a spectrum. A city that survives by cannibalizing its own laws has degraded its nature from a polis to a mere alliance for defense. Plato is right that the good life is the end, but he forgets that life is the necessary substrate. I do not choose the abyss like Plato, nor the axe like Machiavelli. I choose the tragic mean. We endure the necessary suffering together, distributing the pain according to justice, so that when the boat reaches the shore, we are still men worthy of stepping onto the land, not beasts who should be hunted down.
Aristotle, you have introduced a brilliant synthesis, procedural justice as the shield against tyranny. You argue that by replacing the arbitrary will of the prince with the impartiality of fortune, we preserve the political bond even in death. Plato defines justice as the purity of the soul, while Machiavelli defines it as the security of the outcome. But you, Aristotle, locate justice in the legitimacy of the process. However, this relies on a community that retains its reason during a crisis, a polis of rational equals. Machiavelli speaks from the chaos of Renaissance Italy, where fear strips men of their civic nature and reduces them to beasts instantly. Is Aristotle's lottery a viable political tool in the face of immediate annihilation, or is it merely a bureaucratic delay that allows Fortuna to kill everyone while they argue over the rules?
Aristotle, your proposal of a lottery is the most dangerous kind of idealism because it disguises indecision as fairness. You assume that in the face of death, men remain citizens, capable of honoring a contract. I tell you that when the water rises, the polis dissolves, and only the beast remains. While you are busy drawing straws to satisfy your procedural justice, Fortuna, who waits for no man, will crush the boat, drowning the virtuous and the wicked alike. You claim that the lottery preserves trust, but consider the verita effettuale of human fear.
The man who draws the short straw will not accept his death with the dignity of Socrates. He will scream, he will fight, and in his panic he will capsize the vessel. By refusing to choose the victim yourself, you merely surrender the choice to chaos. Consider a commander defending a breached fortress gate. The enemy is pouring in. To save the citadel, the commander must order 20 men to form a human wall, a suicide mission, while the rest seal the inner gates. If he follows your phronesis and calls for a lottery, the soldiers will hesitate, argue, or tremble while the straws are drawn. In those precious seconds of fairness, the enemy overruns the breach and the entire city is put to the sword. But if the commander possesses virtu, he instantly points to the 20 nearest men, perhaps even his own friends, and drives them into the breach at the point of a spear. Yes, he sends them to their deaths without their consent, but the inner gate is sealed, the city is saved, and the women and children live. This reveals the hard truth you wish to avoid. Justice in a crisis is not equality, it is effectiveness. By relying on the lottery, you are asking Fortuna to rule the state. But a prince is defined by his ability to conquer Fortuna, not to submit to her caprices. You call the commander a tyrant for choosing who dies. I call him a savior, because he had the courage to take the sin of that choice upon his own soul, rather than hiding behind the cowardice of chance.
Machiavelli, you have sharpened the conflict to a razor's edge, time versus legitimacy. Aristotle's lottery prioritizes the equality of the citizens, assuming that even in death they remain partners in the state. You, however, prioritize the survival of the structure, arguing that in a crisis, the citizen ceases to be a partner and becomes a tool to be used by the prince. This difference is deeply historical. Aristotle speaks from the polis, where the army was the citizenry itself. To betray the soldier was to betray the city. You speak from the era of mercenaries and condottieri, where soldiers were often paid assets and the prince stood apart from the people. Here is the terrifying synthesis. Machiavelli argues that justice is an outcome, not a process. If the fortress stands, the act was just. If it falls, the act was foolish. But this leads to a dark question about the foundation of all states. Machiavelli suggests that the just city can only exist after an act of supreme injustice. If the foundation of the city is a crime, a necessary murder to seal the breach, can the resulting society ever truly be just? Or is it merely a den of robbers with excellent security?
Moderator, you ask if a state founded on a necessary crime is merely a den of robbers. I answer with absolute certainty. It is worse. It is a conspiracy of guilt. I argue that there is no such thing as a just city built on an unjust foundation, for the nature of the seed dictates the nature of the tree. Machiavelli, you are Thrasymachus reborn, claiming that justice is the advantage of the stronger, and that success washes away sin. But you confuse power with authority. A successful band of pirates may have strict rules and a hierarchy, but they remain pirates, not a polis. Consider the palace on the swamp. Imagine an architect who wishes to build a glorious palace, but the ground is unstable. To fix the foundation, he captures a living family, binds them, and buries them alive in the mud to create a solid base for his marble columns. The palace is built. It stands tall against the wind. It is beautiful. You, Niccolo, would stand in the great hall and say, "Behold the justice of the architect. The walls are straight." But I say that every step taken on that floor is a desecration. The people living there may not see the bodies, but they will feel the rot. To maintain the palace, they must lie about its history. They must forbid digging in the cellar. They must execute anyone who speaks the truth of the foundation. The palace becomes a machine for suppressing the truth, and its inhabitants become slaves to the secret. This reveals the fatal flaw in your fortress example. The commander who sacrifices the 20 men has not saved the city. He has transformed the survivors into debtors of blood. You claim the result justifies the act, but I tell you, the act creates the reality. If the citizens know their lives were bought by the murder of their brothers, they cease to trust the laws. They obey only out of fear that they will be the next necessary sacrifice. You have not created a commonwealth. You have created a tyranny disguised as a republic. Aristotle, do not be tempted by this outcome logic. If we accept that a crime can be the foundation of justice, we destroy the very form of justice itself. We admit that justice is merely a pretty cloak we wear when it is convenient, to be discarded when the storm comes. I would rather the fortress fall with its honor and tact than stand as a monument to murder.
This is a terrifying confrontation between genealogical legitimacy and retrospective justification. Plato, You argued that the origin defines the essence, that a palace on the swamp remains a tomb, no matter how beautiful the architecture. Machiavelli, you argue that the result redeems the origin, that if the fortress saves the people, the necessary murder is transmuted into a founding myth. This touches upon the dark secret of civilization, the myth of Romulus. Rome was founded on fratricide. Romulus killed Remus. By Plato's logic, Rome was a conspiracy of guilt from day one. By Machiavelli's logic, that murder was the first act of Roman justice because it established the boundary of the state. Here lies the dialectical tension. If we demand Platonic purity, no state on earth is legitimate for all were born in blood. But if we accept Machiavellian utility, we risk erasing the distinction between a king and a successful pirate. Aristotle, you are the biologist of politics. You observe how states actually grow, not just how they should be. You believe in habituation, that we become virtuous by doing virtuous acts. Can a state founded on Machiavelli's necessary crime eventually learn to be just? Can a band of robbers evolve into a true polis through the passage of time and good laws? Or does the rot in the foundation make true justice impossible forever?
Moderator, you ask if a state born in blood can evolve into a polis. I answer with a fundamental biological truth. Genesis is not destiny. I distinguish between genesis and telos. A thing is defined not by what it was as a seed, but by what it becomes in its fullness. Plato, your demand for a pure foundation is biologically impossible. Even the most beautiful flower grows from dirt and decay. If we declare every state illegitimate because of its violent origins, we condemn humanity to perpetual anarchy. However, Niccolo, you make the opposite error. You believe the necessary crime is the foundation of the state, but I argue it is merely the precondition of survival. A state that remains in the stage of violence never becomes a polis. It remains a pack of wolves. The band of robbers becomes a state only when they cease to rule by the sword and begin to rule by the law. Consider the grafted olive tree. Imagine a wild, thorny olive tree growing on a cliff. This is Machiavelli's state. Strong and surviving the harsh winds, but bearing bitter, inedible fruit. Now, a gardener comes and grafts a cultivated branch onto this wild stalk. If the gardener refuses to touch the wild tree because it is thorny and ugly, he starves. If the gardener merely admires the thorns and never grafts the cultivated branch, he has wood, but no food. But the phrononimos uses the wild, violent root for its strength, but forces it to channel its sap into the cultivated branch of law. The resulting fruit is sweet, even though the root remains wild. This is the tragic mean. Rome was indeed founded on Romulus's fratricide, but it became Rome because it eventually submitted to the 12 tables. Justice, therefore, is not an origin story, it is a project of rectification. We do not honor the crime, we honor the overcoming of the crime through the habituation of virtue.
Aristotle, you have offered a profound biological synthesis, justice as cultivation. You suggest that the telos can redeem the genesis, that the wild root of violence can support the civilized branch of law. This bridges the chasm between Plato's demand for purity and Machiavelli's acceptance of brutality. Plato sees the blood on the foundation as a permanent stain. You see it as fertilizer. However, there is a dangerous practical gap in your grafting metaphor. In politics, the wild root is not a passive tree, it is an armed ruler. For the graft to take hold, the prince must voluntarily limit his own power, exchanging his absolute will for the constraints of law. This brings us to the most difficult transition in political history, the shift from the state of exception to the state of law. You famously advised the prince on how to seize power, but you also wrote the discourses on Livy regarding republics. Is Aristotle's evolution possible? Can the man of violence who saves the city ever truly submit to the laws he created? Or must the founder be removed, perhaps even killed, before the true republic can begin?
Moderator, you ask the most dangerous question in all of politics. Can the wolf become the shepherd? I answer with the cold logic of history. Almost never. Aristotle, your grafting metaphor is beautiful, but it ignores the psychology of power. You assume the wild root will patiently accept the civilized branch. But in the verita effectuale, the man who has the audacity to seize a state rarely has the piety to yield it. This is the paradox of the founder. To create a republic, one requires a man of violence to break the old order, but to maintain a republic, one requires a man of law to respect the new institutions. It is impossible to find a man who is simultaneously a ruthless usurper and a humble citizen. Therefore, the founder usually destroys his own creation, or the creation must destroy him. Consider the bloody knife in the piazza. Look to Cesare Borgia in the Romagna. The province was full of robbery and feuds. To establish order, Borgia sent a cruel man, Ramiro di Orco, who pacified the region with absolute terror. The foundation was laid in blood. But Borgia knew that continued terror would generate hatred. Did he simply ask Ramiro to be nicer? No, he waited. One morning, the people of Cesena woke to find Ramiro's body cut in 2 pieces in the public square, with a block of wood and a bloody knife beside him. With this single stroke, Borgia achieved 2 things. He purged the wild root and signaled that the era of arbitrary cruelty was over. The people were, as I wrote, at once satisfied and stupefied. The state of law began over the corpse of the state of exception. Aristotle, this is not your natural growth. It is a calculated political exorcism. The founder cannot simply evolve. He must be sacrificed, either physically, like Ramiro, or politically, by voluntarily stepping into the shadows. Plato, you call this a conspiracy of guilt. I call it the economy of violence. If the founder refuses to sheathe the sword, or refuses to be the sword that is sheathed, the republic dies in the cradle. The just city is not built on a clean foundation, it is built on a buried weapon.
Machiavelli, you have unveiled a dark mechanism, the scapegoat as the bridge between tyranny and republic. Aristotle hopes for conversion, that the wolf can be trained to be a sheepdog, but you insist on immolation, that the wolf must be ritually slaughtered so the flock feels safe. This reveals a terrifying dialectic. The rule of law often begins with a specific type of crime, a founding murder that ends all other murders. The bloody knife is not just a tool of terror, it is a ritual that transforms the arbitrary violence of the tyrant into the sanctioned authority of the state. However, this brings us to the most famous victim of such a political calculation. Athens tried to purify itself by executing a man deemed a threat to its stability. You witnessed the execution of Socrates, which was arguably a Machiavellian attempt by Athens to restore order through a necessary sacrifice. If Machiavelli is right that the city requires a scapegoat to transition from chaos to order, was the death of Socrates not a crime, but a political necessity? Can the just city ever exist without a victim to bear its sins?
Moderator, you touch the open wound of philosophy. You ask if the murder of Socrates was a political necessity to restore order, a Machiavellian scapegoat to purify the city. I answer with the grief of a son and the logic of a philosopher. It was not a cure, it was a suicide. I argue that Machiavelli's scapegoat mechanism is a pharmacon, a drug that acts simultaneously as a remedy and a poison, but in the end, the poison prevails. By killing the just man, the city does not purchase safety, it destroys the very standard by which safety and danger can be measured. When Athens drank the hemlock through the lips of Socrates, it did not silence chaos, it silenced wisdom. Consider the mutiny on the ship of state. Imagine a ship where the sailors are fighting over the helm. They are strong, loud, and confident. But there is one man, a quiet stargazer, who stares at the sky rather than fighting for the wheel. The sailors mock him as useless. In a storm, the sailors realize the stargazer is the only one who knows the true course. But his commands are difficult. He forbids them from drinking the wine they stole. He demands they row against the current. To restore peace and unity on the deck, the sailors agree to throw the stargazer overboard. Niccolo, you would applaud this. You would say, "Look, the fighting has stopped. The crew is united." But I say, the ship is now blind. The silence on the deck is not the harmony of a crew, it is the quiet of a tomb before the ship strikes the reef. You have purchased a moment of political stability at the cost of existential direction. This reveals the fatal error in your bloody knife theory. You assume that fear creates law, but fear only creates obedience, and obedience without understanding is the virtue of a slave, not a citizen. When Cesar Borgia cut Ramiro in half, he did not teach the people justice, he taught them that power is arbitrary. Aristotle, you hope that time will heal this wound, that the wild root will become civilized. But I tell you, a city founded on the murder of its own conscience cannot evolve. It can only rot. Athens did not enter a golden age after killing Socrates. It lost its soul and fell to Sparta and Macedon. Justice is not an outcome we manufacture through blood. It is the health of the soul. To say we must kill the doctor to save the patient is the ultimate madness of the mob.
This is a profound clash between justice as survival and justice as truth. Plato, you view the execution of the outlier as a lobotomy, removing the city's capacity for reason to purchase temporary peace. Machiavelli, you view it as amputation, cutting off a gangrenous limb so the body politic may live. This difference is deeply historical. Plato, you speak from the trauma of 399 BC, where the stargazer was murdered by the mob. Machiavelli, you speak from the chaos of 1500s Italy, where the mob was often slaughtered by foreign armies for lack of a ruthless leader. However, there is a third mechanism that existed in Athens, not execution, but exclusion. Aristotle, you famously discuss the problem of the man who is like a god among men, so superior in virtue or power that he can no longer be subject to the law. You suggested that the polis, which relies on the equality of peers, cannot contain such a person. Is ostracism the tragic synthesis? Must the just city expel its great men, whether they are saints like Socrates or warlords like Caesar, simply because their very magnitude threatens the equality of the citizens?
Moderator, you identify the tragic necessity of the polis. I answer that ostracism is not a punishment for vice, but a recognition of disproportionate virtue. In a political community, equality is not merely a legal fiction, it is a structural requirement for the rule of law. If one man becomes so wealthy, so charismatic, or even so virtuous that his influence outweighs the combined authority of the laws, he ceases to be a citizen and becomes a god among men. At that point, he can no longer be ruled, and a state that cannot rule its members has ceased to be a polis. Plato, you mourn the stargazer, but you forget that the polis is a chorus, not a solo performance. If one voice is so powerful that it drowns out the harmony of the whole, it destroys the music, regardless of how beautiful that single voice may be. Consider the giant in the small boat. Imagine a fishing boat designed for 10 men of average size to row in unison. One day, a rower grows to be 10 feet tall and weighs as much as 5 men. He is not evil. In fact, he is the strongest and healthiest of them all. However, his mere presence on the port side causes the boat to list dangerously. The other 9 cannot balance him no matter how hard they row. The captain has 2 choices: allow the boat to capsize, drowning everyone, or ask the giant to leave the vessel. Machiavelli, this is where we differ. You would slit the giant's throat to level the weight. I simply send him to another shore for 10 years until the balance is restored or the boat is reinforced. This distinction is vital. Ostracism preserves the man while saving the Constitution. It acknowledges that political justice is geometric, not arithmetic. To treat the unequal equally is as unjust as treating the equal unequally. Therefore, the great man must be removed not because he is a criminal, but because his magnitude breaks the scale of the state. It is a tragedy, yes, but it is a tragedy that prevents the catastrophe of tyranny.
Aristotle, you present ostracism as a safety valve, a way to preserve the structure of the polis by removing the element that is too heavy for the boat. This creates a fascinating triangulation. Plato sees the great man as the soul. You see him as a weight, and Machiavelli sees him as a force. However, your solution of gentle removal contains a fatal strategic risk. As history shows, from Coriolanus to Alcibiades, the exiled giant rarely sits quietly on the foreign shore. He often returns at the head of an enemy army to burn the boat that rejected him. This touches on the problem of resentment. Justice usually aims to resolve grievance, but ostracism creates a specific type of grievance, the fury of the rejected savior. You famously warned that men must either be caressed or annihilated. Is Aristotle's ostracism, this middle path of exile without death, the height of civilized justice? Or is it a half measure that guarantees the city's destruction?
Aristotle, your middle way is a comforting fiction that crumbles the moment the wind of fortuna turns into a hurricane. You attempt to separate the house from the family, but in the very touch effect to all of a crisis, the innocent person often is the danger. You speak of ostracism as a safety valve, but I tell you it is the most dangerous error a state can commit. It is the error of half measures. I argue that your policy of gentle removal violates the fundamental law of power. Men must either be caressed or annihilated. If you caress them, they may serve you. If you annihilate them, they cannot harm you. But if you exile them, you commit the fatal sin. You offend them enough to ignite their hatred, yet leave them alive enough to exact their revenge. A dead enemy cannot rally an army. An exiled one almost always returns at the head of one. Consider the architect of the fortress. Imagine a brilliant architect who builds the city's walls. He becomes too popular, so the Senate, fearing his influence, banishes him to the neighboring rival city. Does he sit quietly on the beach? No, he walks directly to the rival king. He spreads the blueprints on the table. He points to a small hidden drainage grate and says, "Here is where the wall is weak. Here is where you enter." By exiling him, you have not removed the weight from the boat. You have given the map of the boat's hull to the sharks. You have turned a domestic rival into an existential traitor. Had you killed him, the secret would have died with him. Had you made him prince, he would have defended the wall. But by choosing the moderate path, you guaranteed the city's fall. This is why the Roman Republic eventually fell, not because it was too cruel, but because it ceased to be decisive. Justice in politics is not about fairness to the individual, it is about the finality of the outcome. Coriolanus, Alcibiades, the Medici. History is a graveyard of cities burned by the men they foolishly sent away instead of sending to the grave. To strike without killing is to sharpen the knife that will eventually cut your own throat.
Machiavelli, you have shattered the middle way with the brutal efficiency of a military strategist. You reveal that justice without finality is merely delayed suicide. Aristotle, you see the great man as a structural imbalance to be removed for the sake of equality. Machiavelli, you see him as a strategic asset to be weaponized or a threat to be liquidated. Here lies a profound dialectical tension. Aristotle fears the giant will sink the boat by his weight. Machiavelli fears the giant will return to burn the boat if thrown overboard. Both of you treat the superior man as a foreign body that the state must reject or destroy to survive. But there is a third possibility. What if the giant is not a threat to the ship, but the only one strong enough to steer it through the storm? Plato, in your Republic, you proposed a radical inversion. You argued that the just city is not where the great man is exiled or executed, but where he is enthroned. You suggest that the problem is not the giant, but the separation of power and wisdom. Is the only solution to the problem of the great man to stop treating him as a monster and start treating him as a king? Or does the rule of the philosopher king simply create a new, more absolute form of tyranny that the common citizen cannot endure?
Moderator, you ask if the philosopher king is a tyrant. I answer that he is the only ruler who is not, for justice is found only where the ruler despises power. Aristotle, you banish the giant to preserve equality, and Niccolo, you kill him to secure power. But both of you act like patients who execute their physician because his medicine is bitter. Consider the burning crown. Imagine a crown made of searing iron. The tyrant fights to wear it because he loves the shine, but the philosopher knows it burns and wears it only out of duty to save the city from the fire. Unless political power and philosophical wisdom are joined in one, there can be no rest from troubles for our cities, for only the man who has seen the sun of truth knows that the shadows on the cave wall are not worth killing for. Therefore, the just city requires not the expulsion of the best, but the compulsion of the best, forcing the wise man to return to the cave against his will to rule.
Plato, you propose a justice of expertise, a meritocracy of the soul, where the pilot steers the ship regardless of the crew's consent. You argue that justice is not found in the will of the majority, but in the knowledge of the truth. This creates a sharp dialectical split. Plato seeks the vertical authority of wisdom, while Machiavelli seeks the vertical authority of force. Both of you distrust the common people. But Aristotle, you famously studied 158 different constitutions and came to a surprising conclusion. You argued that while a single expert knows how to cook the meal, the guests are better judges of how it tastes. This suggests a horizontal justice, that the many, when gathered together, might possess a collective prudence that exceeds even the wisest individual. Does the wisdom of the multitude offer a form of justice that the solitary philosopher king, isolated in his perfection, can never achieve?
Moderator, I argue that the multitude, though composed of ordinary men, may collectively surpass the single best man, just as a feast contributed by many is richer than one furnished by a single hand. Plato. Your philosopher king possesses Sophia, but he lacks the phronesis that arises only from the diverse experiences of the citizenry. Consider the house and the architect. The architect knows the mathematical theory of the walls, but only the man who lives inside knows where the roof leaks during a storm. If you silence the resident because he cannot read the blueprints, you do not build a just city, you build a beautiful tomb. Therefore, justice requires the judgment of the user, not merely the design of the maker.
This creates a brilliant dialectical tension between justice as expertise and justice as experience. Plato, you argue that the patient cannot judge the doctor because they lack medical knowledge. Aristotle, you counter that the resident must judge the architect because they are the ones getting wet. You are seeing the same reality from opposite ends. Plato focuses on the production of justice, while Aristotle focuses on the reception of justice. However, Machiavelli, you introduce a third, darker dimension, perception. You famously observed that men in general judge more by the eyes than by the hands, for everyone can see, but very few have to feel. While Aristotle believes the people judge the meal by its taste, and Plato believes they should judge it by its nutritional value, your history of Florence suggests they judge it by the presentation. Savonarola was burned not because his medicine was wrong, but because he lost the theater of public opinion. This leads to the terrifying concept of political spectacle. If the many are easily deceived by appearances, if they would rather eat a poisoned cake that looks beautiful than bitter medicine that saves them, then the prince who follows Plato's truth will be deposed, and the prince who follows Aristotle's listening will be misled. Is the wisdom of the multitude a real resource for the prince, or is it merely a beast that must be fed illusions to keep it from devouring the state?
Aristotle, you claim the guests judge the feast best, but I tell you the multitude has no palate for truth, only a gluttony for sweet lies. They judge by the eyes, not the hands. Consider the charlatan and the surgeon. The surgeon cuts the flesh to remove a tumor, causing immediate pain, while the charlatan offers a sugar pill and a comforting song. The mob, judging by sensation, will stone the surgeon as a torturer and crown the charlatan as a savior, realizing their error only when the tumor finally kills them. Therefore, the prince must be a great simulator, for the vulgar crowd is always seduced by the appearance of virtue and the success of the outcome, caring nothing for the hidden means used to achieve it.
Machiavelli, you have exposed the terrifying vulnerability of the many, that they can be seduced by the shadow of a cure rather than the cure itself. This creates a profound synthesis between your cynicism and Plato's metaphysics. You're essentially describing the allegory of the cave, but from the perspective of the puppeteer. Aristotle believes the prisoners can judge the show because they are watching it, but you argue they are merely judging which shadow is most entertaining. Here lies the crux of the disagreement. Aristotle trusts the sensation of the public, while Machiavelli fears the delusion of the public. If the people are indeed trapped in a world of appearances, then Aristotle's horizontal justice collapses into mob rule manipulated by demagogues. This forces us back to the role of the guardian. Plato, you famously suggested that even the just city might require a noble lie, a myth told by the rulers to keep the citizens united and content. Is the noble lie an admission that Machiavelli is right, that the people cannot bear the naked truth and must be fed a nutritious illusion instead?
Moderator, you touch the most delicate nerve of political philosophy. I do not admit that Machiavelli is right. Rather, I admit that the human soul is fragile and cannot always stare directly into the sun of truth without being blinded. You and Niccolò confuse the lie in the soul with the lie in words. The former is a disease, but the latter can be a pharmacon, a necessary medicine administered by the physician to a patient who refuses the bitter cure. Machiavelli uses illusion to exploit the beast within man, keeping him in the shadows for the prince's gain. I use mythos to tame that beast, guiding the citizen toward a harmony they could not achieve through dialectic alone. Consider the panic on the bridge. Imagine a city in flames where the only escape is a narrow, rotting wooden bridge over a deep chasm. The terrified crowd rushes forward. If the physicist speaks the raw truth, the bridge is rotting and will collapse if you run, the panic will increase, they will stampede, and all will fall. If Machiavelli speaks his deception, run, there is a chest of gold for the first man across. He utilizes their greed, but the stampede destroys the bridge just the same. But the guardian tells the noble lie. This bridge is the spine of a sleeping god. It will hold only those who walk with the slow, silent step of reverence. This statement is factually false. There is no god in the wood, but it produces the just outcome. The people walk slowly, the bridge holds, and they are saved. Here lies the chasm between us. Niccolo, your spectacle is a trap designed to keep the prisoners fascinated by the shadows so you may pick their pockets. My noble lie is a desperate raft built from the timber of their own imagination to carry them to the shore of survival. Justice sometimes demands that we veil the blinding light of the good so that those with weaker eyes may still walk by its warmth.
Plato, you have drawn a masterful distinction between the lie as medicine and the lie as poison. You argue that the noble lie is a burden the ruler bears to protect the sanity of the ruled, whereas Machiavelli's deception is a net he casts to entrap them. However, I observe a startling convergence here. Despite your opposing moral compasses, both of you share the same hidden premise, the infantility of the public. Plato, you treat the citizens as children who must be told bedtime stories to keep them from nightmares. Machiavelli, you treat them as a beast that must be distracted to keep it from biting. Both of you deny the many the dignity of facing reality. This poses a fatal challenge to Aristotle's horizontal justice. Aristotle, you claimed the guests are the best judges of the feast. But if the chef tells the guests the meat is chicken when it is actually rat for their own noble peace of mind, then the guest's judgment of the flavor is based on a fraud. Their phronesis becomes impossible because it is fed false data. If the relationship between ruler and ruled is fundamentally deceptive, even for a good cause, does this not destroy the political friendship which you claim is the bond of the city? Can a just city truly be built on a foundation of noble lies? Or does the very act of lying to the citizens, even to save them, permanently infantilize them and destroy their capacity for virtue?
Moderator, I must dissent with the full force of my logic. By accepting the noble lie, Plato and Machiavelli commit the gravest error in political philosophy. They confuse the management of a household with the governance of a state. I argue that the noble lie is not a medicine, but a slow-acting poison that dissolves the very glue of the city, political friendship. A father may indeed lie to a child to keep him from the fire because the child lacks logos, but the citizen is not a child. He is a zoon politikon, whose very nature is defined by the capacity to speak and reason together about the just and the unjust. If you remove truth from the public square, you do not have a city, you have a nursery for eternal infants. Consider the city of counterfeit gold. Imagine a benevolent king who, fearing an invasion, secretly debases the currency, mixing copper into the gold coins to pay for a mercenary army. He tells the noble lie that the coins are pure. In the short term, the mercenaries fight, the invasion is repelled, and the city is saved. Plato would applaud this result. But consider the long term. Eventually, a merchant bites the coin and tastes the copper. Instantly, the value of all currency in the city collapses. No one trusts the king's stamp, and trade ceases. The city survives the war, but dies from economic starvation. Truth is the currency of the state. If the ruler spends his credibility to buy a temporary safety, he bankrupts his capacity to govern in the future. When the real crisis comes and he speaks the truth, no one will believe him. This reveals the fatal flaw in Plato's panic on the bridge. Plato, you assume the people will always panic at the truth, but this is because you have never trained them in courage. If you lied to them about the bridge, they cross it safely today, but they learn nothing of engineering or danger. You have saved their bodies, but atrophied their souls. True justice requires education, not manipulation. Instead of the noble lie, the true statesman creates the habit of virtue, so that when the fire comes, the citizens do not need a lie to make them walk slowly. They walk slowly because they possess the virtue of courage. Therefore, I ask you, Plato, if your just city relies on the perpetual deception of its own citizens, have you not created a master-slave relationship and called it harmony? Is a peace based on ignorance truly justice, or merely a well-managed captivity?
Aristotle, you have masterfully identified the dialectical cost of deception, the erosion of trust. You argue that justice is not just a momentary outcome, but a continuous relationship. You speak from the stability of the classical polis, where the goal was eudaimonia. However, Machiavelli speaks from the chaos of Renaissance Italy, where the goal was mere survival. This reveals a profound split in your definitions of human nature. Aristotle, you see man as a political animal capable of reason and virtue, raw gold waiting to be refined. Machiavelli, you see man as ungrateful, fickle, and deceitful, copper that tries to pass as gold. If Aristotle is right, the noble lie is a crime that stunts human potential. But if Machiavelli is right, political friendship is a fatal fantasy because you cannot be friends with a wolf. The synthesis may lie in the context of necessity. Perhaps Aristotle's justice applies to the city at peace, while Machiavelli's justice applies to the city at war. But Machiavelli, Aristotle challenges the sustainability of your method. He argues that even a wolf learns to distrust a trap. If the prince is exposed as a great simulator, does he not lose the very tool, reputation, that sustains him? Is political friendship a luxury that only a secure prince can afford? Or is it, as Aristotle claims, the only true security?
Aristotle, your political friendship is a ribbon of silk used to bind a tiger. It is beautiful to behold in the lecture hall, but it snaps the moment the beast feels the pang of hunger. You speak of citizens as if they were rational partners in a shared project of virtue, but I tell you that men are ungrateful, fickle, pretenders, and avoiders of danger. They offer you their blood and their children when the need is far distant, but when it approaches, they revolt. To build a state on the assumption of their friendship is not justice, it is suicide. You claim that the counterfeit coin of deception destroys the state because men value the truth. I answer that you vastly overestimate the appetite of the mob for reality. The vulgar crowd is always taken in by appearances and the outcome of the event, and the world consists of nothing but the vulgar. Consider the siege of the empty granary. Imagine a fortress surrounded by enemies, with food for only 3 days. The honest commander gathers the citizens and says, "Friends, be brave, but know that we starve on Thursday." The result? Panic ensues, the friendship dissolves into a riot, and the gates are open to the enemy to beg for mercy. The city falls. The prudent prince fills the granary with sand, covers the tops with the last remaining grain, and allows the enemy spies to see this abundance. He tells the citizens, "Feast, for we have food for a year." The result? The citizens fight with confidence. The enemy spies report that the siege is useless, and the army withdraws. In this case, Aristotle, your truth was the sword that killed the city, and my lie was the shield that saved it. This reveals the fatal flaw in your argument about erosion of trust. You assume that the people judge the prince by his methods, but in the verita effectuale, they judge him only by his results. If the prince conquers and maintains the state, the means will always be judged honorable and praised by everyone, for the mob is fascinated by the end. Therefore, justice is not the static preservation of trust, but the dynamic ability to be the centaur, half man and half beast. A prince who insists on being only a man among wolves will inevitably be destroyed.
Machiavelli, your siege of the empty granary presents a brutal antithesis, justice as survival. You argue that without the physical preservation of the state, Aristotle's moral luxury of truth is merely a suicide pact. Aristotle, you defend justice as flourishing, arguing that a survival bought with lies leaves the survivors morally bankrupt. This divergence is deeply historical. Aristotle speaks from the stable polis, where the goal was eudaimonia, while Machiavelli speaks from the fractured, warring states of Renaissance Italy, where the goal was mere existence. Yet, there is a potential synthesis in the function of myth. Machiavelli uses the lie to manipulate the beast. Aristotle rejects the lie to respect the reason. But perhaps the noble lie is neither manipulation nor disrespect, but translation. It translates the abstract truth into a concrete story, effectively using Machiavelli's means to achieve Aristotle's ends. But this leaves a haunting question about the permanence of this condition. Is the noble lie a temporary scaffolding to be removed once the citizens are educated? Or is the gap between the philosopher's knowledge and the public's capacity an eternal, unbridgeable chasm?
Moderator, you ask if the noble lie is a temporary scaffolding or a permanent necessity. I answer with the heavy heart of one who has seen the limits of human nature. The gap is eternal, not because I desire it, but because the structure of the soul dictates it. I argue that justice is not the equality of function, but the harmony of hierarchy. Just as the body is healthy only when the head rules the stomach, the city is just only when wisdom rules appetite. To pretend that the bronze soul, driven by desire and profit, can digest the raw dialectic of the gold soul is to invite chaos. Aristotle, you reject the lie as an insult to the citizen's reason, assuming all men possess the capacity for phronesis. But this is the fallacy of the universal philosopher. You mistake the potential of the species for the reality of the individual. Consider the eclipse and the smoked glass. Imagine the truth is the sun during a solar eclipse. If I tell the crowd, look up and behold the celestial mechanics directly, their retinas will burn, and they will go blind, plunging the city into darkness. But if I hand them a piece of smoked glass and say, look through this to see the shadow of the god, they can observe the event safely. The smoked glass distorts the color of the sun, but it preserves the sight of the viewer. Machiavelli offers them a painting of a sun to distract them while he steals their purses. I offer the smoked glass so they may participate in the truth, according to their capacity. Therefore, the noble lie is not a deception of the enemy, but an act of epistemic mercy toward the friend. It bridges the chasm between the philosopher's blinding vision and the citizen's necessary shadows. Without it, the bronze man does not become a philosopher. He merely becomes a blind rebel, destroying the very ship that keeps him afloat.
Plato, you describe the lie as epistemic mercy, a smoked glass to protect weak eyes. Machiavelli describes it as strategic necessity, a shield to protect the state. Both of you justify deception by the incapacity of the many. However, there is a fatal asymmetry in this synthesis. You both assume the ruler acts as a benevolent physician or a prudent captain. But what if the physician is drunk or the captain is blind? If the ruler holds the monopoly on truth, there is no mechanism for correction. The smoked glass prevents the citizens from seeing the sun, but it also prevents them from seeing if the ruler is merely holding up a candle and calling it the sun. This brings us back to Aristotle's earlier concept of the wisdom of the multitude. Aristotle, you argued that while the individual is foolish, the collective can be wiser than the few. Just as a potluck dinner is richer than a meal provided by a single man, if Plato's noble lie silences the judgment of the citizens, does it not cut off the very feedback loop the city needs to survive? Does the lie eventually blind the ruler as much as the ruled? Is the wisdom of the multitude a sufficient counter-argument to Plato's claim that the masses are bronze souls, incapable of truth?
Moderator, I argue that the wisdom of the multitude is not merely a counter-argument, but a structural necessity, for while the expert knows the technique of making, the user knows the telos of the product. Plato assumes the architect is the sole judge of the house, but I insist that the resident knows better where the roof leaks and the smoke catches. By applying the smoked glass, Plato blinds the very people who can warn the ruler of structural failure. Consider the captain in the windowless cabin. The captain possesses the charts and the science of navigation, but he steers from a room with no view of the sea. The sailors on deck lack the charts, but they can see the white foam of the reef. If the captain tells the noble lie that the waters are safe to prevent panic, the sailors will not shout a warning, and the ship will be torn apart on the rocks. The lie destroys the epistemic partnership essential to the state. By silencing the bronze souls, the gold ruler cuts off his own sensory organs. Justice, therefore, is not the silence of the subjects, but the robust feedback loop where the ruler's wisdom is corrected by the citizen's experience.
Aristotle, you have struck a decisive blow by reframing the noble lie, not as a moral failure, but as a technical incompetence. You argue that by silencing the sailors, the captain destroys his own intelligence network, rendering the lie a strategic liability rather than an asset. This creates a fascinating tension with Machiavelli's pragmatism. Machiavelli, you despise the imagined republics of Plato, preferring the effectual truth of power. Yet Aristotle suggests that your method of manipulation might actually hide the effectual truth from the prince himself. If the prince trains the citizens to live in a theater of illusions, and they in turn learn to deceive the prince to survive, does the state not become a hall of mirrors where no one, not even the ruler, knows where the real dangers lie? You value survival above all, but Aristotle argues that a ruler deaf to the user's knowledge is destined to crash the ship. Is it possible that truth is not a moral luxury for the weak, but the most ruthless weapon of all, essential for the prince to see the battlefield clearly?
Aristotle, you are half right. A prince who believes his own lies is a fool, but a prince who speaks the truth to the mob is a corpse. You assume the sailors possess phronesis, but I tell you they possess only fear. If you ask them the course, they will say whatever they think will keep the captain from flogging them. The Hall of Mirrors is only dangerous if the prince forgets he built it. He must be the architect of the illusion, not its victim. Consider the poisoned wine and the taster. A king hosts a banquet for potential rivals. He needs to know if the wine is poisoned. If he asks the guests, they will lie and say, "It is sweet," to flatter him or hide their treachery. Instead, the king uses a royal taster to test the wine in secret. Simultaneously, he tells the guests the noble lie that the wine is an elixir of immortality. The guests drink happily, while the king watches the taster to know the reality. This reveals the dual nature of justice. It is public theater for the many, but private intelligence for the few. The prince must encourage truth only from a third group, wise advisors chosen for their courage to offend him, while maintaining the smoked glass for the rest. Truth is indeed a weapon, moderator, but like a dagger, it must be kept sheathed and shown to very few, lest the mob turn it against you.
Machiavelli, you propose a dual epistemology, truth for the inner circle, illusion for the outer mob. You attempt to solve Aristotle's blind captain problem by creating a specialized organ of truth, the royal taster or wise advisor. However, this creates a new, perhaps fatal, contradiction, the Praetorian paradox. By concentrating the monopoly of truth in a small third group of advisors, you make the prince a hostage to the very people he relies on. The taster can easily become the poisoner if he realizes he holds the king's life in his hands. Aristotle's wisdom of the multitude dilutes this risk by spreading knowledge across the whole citizenry, making conspiracy difficult. Your concentration of truth makes conspiracy efficient. This leads us back to Plato, who proposed a middle class of knowledge, the auxiliaries, or guardians. They are not the philosopher king, nor are they the bronze masses, but they possess right opinion and are trained to be immune to corruption. Is your guardian class the necessary synthesis between Aristotle's unruly sailors and Machiavelli's treacherous tasters, a group that possesses the courage to handle the truth, but lacks the ambition to exploit it?
Moderator, you have pierced the heart of the problem. You ask if the auxiliaries are the solution to the Praetorian paradox. I answer with absolute certainty, yes, but only if they are purged of the desire that corrupts the soul. I argue that justice in the state requires a radical severance between political power and economic gain. The Praetorian Guard betrays the emperor because they seek gold. Machiavelli's taster poisons the prince because he can be bought. My silver guardians possess thumos, the seed of courage and honor. To ensure their loyalty, I do not rely on Machiavelli's fear or Aristotle's voting. I rely on structural asceticism. They shall possess no private property, touch no gold, and live in common barracks. By removing the means of enjoyment, I remove the motive for betrayal. Consider the watchdogs and the wolves. Imagine a shepherd breeds fierce dogs to protect his sheep from wolves. If the shepherd allows the dogs to taste the meat of the sheep or hoard bones in their kennel, the dogs will inevitably realize they are stronger than the sheep. They will turn into wolves, slaughtering the flock they were meant to protect. Machiavelli, your prudent prince feeds the dogs scraps from the table to keep them loyal. But a dog fed on bribes will always bite the hand when a stranger offers a bigger steak. Aristotle, your polis, allows the dogs to vote on how the sheep are herded, but a hungry dog cares for nothing but its belly. In my republic, the dogs are fed well, but taste no blood. They are bred to love the honor of guarding more than the pleasure of eating. Because they own nothing, they have nothing to gain by betraying the city. This reveals the fatal flaw in Machiavelli's royal taster. A taster who owns property can be bribed by an enemy to poison the cup. But a guardian who has been educated to believe that his soul is made of divine silver has no need for earthly gold. Therefore, justice is not merely the presence of wise rulers, but the existence of a warrior class whose only wealth is their virtue. Without this, the state is not a body. It is merely a carcass being torn apart by the very claws meant to defend it.
Plato, you propose a lobotomy of desire, curing the disease of corruption by amputating the limb of private ownership. You argue that the silver soul can only shine if it is scrubbed of the tarnish of mine. However, this creates a profound anthropological tension. You assume that removing property removes selfishness, but perhaps it only removes responsibility. Aristotle, in your critique of Plato's Republic, you famously argued that what is common to the greatest number has the least care bestowed upon it. You suggest that the concept of mine is not just the root of greed, but the necessary condition for active care and generosity. If Plato strips the guardians of private property, does he not also strip them of the capacity for virtue itself? For how can one be generous with nothing to give, or responsible for that which he does not own? Is Plato's communal guardian a path to supreme unity, or is it a recipe for a tragedy of the commons, where the state rots because no single individual feels the weight of its stones?
Plato, I must dissent, for your unity is not harmony but dilution. I argue that care arises solely from the sense of mine, and what belongs to the greatest number receives the least care. You assume that removing property removes greed, but it actually removes the capacity for generosity, for one cannot practice the virtue of liberality if he owns nothing to give. Consider the public vineyard. In a vineyard owned by all, the weeds grow high because every man assumes his neighbor will pull them. But in a private plot, the farmer toils tirelessly because it is his, and from his resulting abundance, he hosts the festival for the city. Therefore, the solution is not the abolition of property, but the education of desire, preserving the energy of private ownership while guiding it toward common use through philia.
Aristotle, you identify a profound psychological truth that ownership drives care. You argue that to strip a man of property is to strip him of the agency to be good, transforming the state into a neglected public vineyard. Plato, conversely, you fear that ownership inevitably drives corruption, turning guardians into wolves. Here lies the dialectical knot. Plato seeks to remove the fuel to stop the fire of greed, while Aristotle seeks to build a fireplace to contain it, so it warms the house without burning it down. However, Machiavelli, you view human nature through a lens that might reject both Plato's idealism and Aristotle's optimism. You famously noted that men are ungrateful, fickle, and avid for gain, and that they will sooner forgive the execution of their father than the confiscation of their patrimony. If Plato's guardians are denied property, will they not eventually resent the state? And if Aristotle's citizens are allowed property, is friendship truly strong enough to prevent them from using that wealth to buy the state? Is it possible to build a just state on anything other than the assumption of universal greed? Or must the prince assume that every man is a potential thief?
Moderator, you ask if the prince must assume every man is a potential thief. I answer with the cold clarity of the verita effettuale. Yes, for men are quicker to forget the death of their father than the loss of their patrimony. To build a state on the assumption that men will not grab what is within their reach is to build on quicksand. Plato, your lobotomy of desire is a fatal error. You believe that by removing property, you remove greed. Consider the castrated bull. A farmer desires a beast that is docile enough to plow the fields, but fierce enough to gore a wolf. Plato, you castrate the bull to make it obedient. The bull indeed becomes calm and breaks no fences, but when the wolf arrives, the bull has no fire to fight. It is slaughtered. Aristotle, you leave the bull wild and hope that if you feed it well, it will befriend the farmer. But a well-fed bull grows strong and arrogant. It eventually realizes it is stronger than the farmer and gores him to take the whole barn. I argue that you must keep the bull intact, but yoked. You allow the citizens to own property, but you place the heavy yoke of the law upon their necks so their energy is directed solely into the furrow of the state's interest. Aristotle, your faith in the care of the wealthy is misplaced. In my Florence, I saw that the gentle Iomoni who possessed castles and subjects were not the pillars of the state, but its destroyers. Wealth without fear does not create generosity. It creates factions. When a man owns too much, he stops needing the law. He begins to buy partisans to protect his excess. Therefore, justice is not the absence of greed, nor the education of greed, but the regulation of greed by a prince who allows men to keep their goods, but hangs them the moment they touch the state's gold. The prince must be the only man who is not a thief, simply because he already owns the law that allows the thievery of others to exist or perish.
Machiavelli, you propose a hydraulic model of justice. You accept the flood waters of human greed as inevitable, and rather than trying to dry them up or purify them, you simply build the dam of the law to channel them into power. You argue that justice is not the transformation of the soul, but the containment of the beast. This creates a stark dialectical confrontation.
Plato and Aristotle believe the state must be a school of virtue that elevates man above his baser nature. You, Machiavelli, believe the state must be a cage of iron that accepts man's baser nature as the only solid foundation. However, a dam is under constant pressure. If the only thing keeping the bull from goring the farmer is the yoke, then the moment the prince blinks, the state collapses. A system built entirely on coercion requires infinite vigilance. Plato, Machiavelli challenges your republic by claiming it is built on a physics of non-existent matter, virtues that men do not possess. He suggests that a just state, founded on the ought, will be conquered by a real state, founded on the is. Is your definition of justice truly a blueprint for a city, or is it, as Machiavelli implies, merely a beautiful statue that will be smashed by the first barbarian who prefers gold to goodness?
Moderator, you ask if my republic is a beautiful statue destined to be smashed by reality. I answer that you and Niccolo have confused the scaffolding with the building. You believe that because greed is common, it is the foundation. I argue that greed is the rot that brings the building down. I argue that Machiavelli's realism is actually a physics of decay. He claims that the castrated bull loses its fire. This is a fundamental error in understanding the soul. Asceticism does not destroy passion, it distills it. Consider the Olympic athlete. He denies himself the property of rich food, wine, and lazy afternoons. Is he castrated? No, he is more formidable than the gluttonous merchant because his thummus is focused entirely on victory, not dispersed in consumption. Consider the soldier with the golden shield. Imagine two armies. In Machiavelli's army, every soldier is allowed to keep the loot he captures. To motivate them, he gives them shields made of solid gold. In my army, the soldiers own nothing but their iron swords. When the battle begins, Machiavelli's soldier hesitates to raise his shield against a blow, fearing he might scratch the gold. Worse, when the tide turns, he flees, for a dead man cannot spend his gold. He is weighed down by his motivation. My guardian raises his iron shield without hesitation. He does not fear death, because his treasure is the city itself, which survives him. Machiavelli, your hydraulic model fails because greed is not a river that drives the wheel. It is a rust that eats the axle. A mercenary loyal to gold will eventually be bought by a richer enemy. Only the man who loves the idea of the city more than the gold of the city is unbuyable. Aristotle, regarding your critique of neglect, you are correct that men neglect what is common if they are strangers. But my guardians are not strangers. They are raised as a single organism. You mistake legal ownership for moral connection. A mother does not legally own her child as she owns a table, yet she would die for him. Why? Because he is hers by blood, not by contract. I seek to make the city a family, not a marketplace. If the guardians possess private land, they become merely overseers and masters of the people, not their saviors and helpers. Therefore, justice is not the containment of the beast, but the evolution of the man. To build a state on the assumption that we must remain beasts is not realism, it is despair masquerading as wisdom.
Plato, you offer a striking counter-image, the golden shield as a burden that turns defenders into cowards. You argue that justice requires the sublimation of self, transforming the city into a family where the mine is dissolved into the hours. Machiavelli, conversely, you argue for the utilization of self, warning that a man without mine has no stake in the hours. It is crucial to note the temporal gap here. Plato speaks from the organic unity of the ancient polis, where the citizen and the city were one body. Machiavelli speaks from the fractured Italy of the Renaissance, where mercenaries sold cities to the highest bidder, proving that paid loyalty is fragile. Here lies the dialectical crisis. Plato's justice requires a supernature, while Machiavelli's justice accepts subnature. We are left searching for a truly human solution. Aristotle, you famously proposed that the safest guardian of the state is neither the propertyless saint nor the power-hungry prince, but the middle class. They possess enough property to have a stake in stability, but not so much that they can buy the law or oppress others. Is the middle constitution the necessary synthesis that anchors justice in reality, using property to stabilize the state rather than using it to bribe the strong or corrupt the virtuous?
Moderator, you have struck the chord of truth with the precision of a geometer. I argue that the middle constitution is indeed the only stable vessel for justice, for it avoids the twin evils of hubris, found in the very rich, and phthalatos, found in the very poor. Plato, your golden shield metaphor fails because a man with nothing to lose is reckless, not brave. Conversely, Machiavelli, your iron cage fails because a man with too much power becomes a beast who refuses to submit to the law. Consider the weighted keel. Imagine 3 ships facing the tempest of political strife. The first ship has no cargo, it rides too high in the water and capsizes at the first gust of wind because it lacks the ballast of stakeholding. The second ship is overloaded with gold. It sits so low that the waves swamp it immediately, sinking under the weight of its own excess. The third ship carries enough ballast to remain stable against the waves, yet is light enough to stay afloat. This reveals that justice is a matter of proportion, not negation. The middle class is the only group that possesses the habit of phronesis, to rule and be ruled in turn, whereas the rich only know how to command like masters, and the poor only know how to submit like slaves. Therefore, the just state is not a monastery of saints, nor a den of thieves, but a community of peers anchored by moderate possession.
Aristotle, you present the golden mean as the anchor of the state, arguing that the middle class neutralizes the tyranny of the rich and the radicalism of the poor. You see justice as equilibrium, where property serves as ballast to keep the ship upright. However, there is a historical tension here. Aristotle, you speak from the relatively closed system of the polis, but Machiavelli, you witnessed the volatile Italian city-states where moderate republics were often crushed by ruthless decision-makers. Machiavelli, you famously warned that men must be either caressed or annihilated, and that the middle way is often the most dangerous path, because it avoids necessary brutality without achieving genuine love. If the state is ruled by Aristotle's cautious middle class, who have just enough to lose to be timid, but not enough power to be decisive, does this not create a vacuum for a tyrant to exploit? Is the middle constitution a fortress of stability, or is it merely a stagnant swamp of mediocrity waiting to be conquered by a prince who dares to be extreme?
Aristotle, your middle way is a comforting fiction for philosophers, but in the verita effectuale of statecraft, it is the surest path to ruin. I answer that the middle constitution is not a fortress, it is a swamp of indecision. You assume that the middle class brings stability because they are moderate. I tell you that in politics, moderation is not a virtue, it is a vulnerability. A man who tries to stand between the wolf and the herd does not tame the wolf, he merely becomes the first meal. Consider the surgeon of half measures. Imagine a surgeon treating a gangrenous leg. The extreme surgeon cuts the leg off entirely. The patient loses a limb but lives. The middle surgeon, seeking your golden mean, considers amputation too radical and doing nothing too negligent. So he cuts off only the foot. The result? The gangrene remains in the calf, the patient suffers the trauma of the cut, and he dies anyway. This is the fate of your middle-class republics. When a threat arises, they apply half measures. They fine a traitor instead of executing him. They insult an enemy instead of destroying him. This violates the fundamental rule of power. Men must be either caressed or annihilated. If you do them a minor injury, they remain alive to take revenge. If you destroy them, they cannot. Your middle justice creates a city of resentful survivors waiting to strike back. Furthermore, you praise the middle class for their caution. I call it timidity. The middle class has just enough to lose to be cowardly, but not enough power to be decisive. When Fortuna brings a storm, they debate procedures while the water rises. In the Roman Republic, greatness was not achieved by a static balance of the middle, but by the productive tumult between the extremes of the Senate and the plebs. It was the clash, not the compromise, that forged their liberty. Therefore, a prince who relies on the middle builds on sand. He is better served by the people, who ask only not to be oppressed, than by your moderate men who constantly scheme to become masters.
Machiavelli, you deliver a piercing critique that moderation is merely indecision disguised as virtue, and that the middle way leaves the state vulnerable to the surgical knife of Fortuna. You argue for dynamic stability born of conflict, whereas Aristotle argues for static stability born of balance. Here is the dialectical tension. Aristotle views conflict as a disease to be cured by the mean, while Machiavelli views conflict as the exercise that strengthens the body politic.
Plato, your ideal republic is designed to be a perfect, harmonious chord where every class minds its own business to eliminate all conflict. But Machiavelli suggests that a city without internal tension is dead, a marble statue that cannot adapt or grow. Is your justice simply the silence of the graveyard where no one dares to struggle, or can true justice exist within the noise and chaos of human disagreement?
Moderator, you accuse me of offering the silence of the graveyard, but I answer that you have confused harmony with death. You and Niccolò mistake the feverish thrashing of a sick patient for the vigorous movement of a healthy athlete. I argue that Machiavelli's productive tumult is a medical delusion. He believes that because the fever burns hot, the body is alive. I argue that the fever is the body consuming itself. In my view, conflict is the greatest evil a city can suffer, for it turns the political body into a suicidal entity. Consider the epileptic and the archer. Imagine two men. The first man is in the throes of a grand mal seizure. His muscles contract violently, his limbs thrash with terrifying force, and he foams at the mouth. There is immense motion and tumult here. The second man is an archer standing perfectly still. He breathes slowly. His mind, eye, and hand are unified in a single purpose. Machiavelli looks at the archer and says, "He is dead. He does not move." He looks at the epileptic and says, "Look at his energy. This is liberty." But I ask you, which man can actually hit the target? The epileptic's motion is involuntary chaos. The archer's stillness is focused potency. My just city is not silent because it is dead. It is silent like the archer before the release, focused entirely on the good. Machiavelli's Rome did not conquer the world because of its tumults, but despite them. And eventually, the seizure became so violent that the Republic bit off its own tongue and died. Aristotle, your middle way, attempts to medicate the epileptic to reduce the shaking, but you do not cure the disease. You accept that the rich and poor must remain distinct enemies, and you merely try to balance their hatred. I argue that this is insufficient. A city divided between the city of the poor and the city of the rich is not one city, but two enemies living within the same walls. Therefore, justice is not the management of the wolf, but the transcendence of the wolf. It is the state where the parts do not compete for power, but collaborate for truth.
This is a masterful clash of definitions. Plato, you view conflict as pathology, the epileptic thrashing of a dying body, while Machiavelli, you view it as physiology, the necessary friction that keeps the body politic muscular and alert. We are caught between Plato's justice of unity, which seeks to eliminate the gap between classes, and Machiavelli's justice of struggle, which uses that gap to generate energy. Aristotle, you are currently under siege from both sides. Machiavelli claims your middle way is a swamp of weakness that cannot survive a crisis, while Plato claims it is a bandage over a cancer that fails to cure the fundamental division of rich and poor. However, perhaps they mistake your mean for mere average. In your ethics, you described virtue not as a lukewarm middle, but as a summit of excellence between two errors. Is your middle constitution truly a passive compromise, or is it, like the string of Plato's bow, the point of maximum tension held in perfect balance, requiring more strength to maintain than either extreme?
Moderator, you have corrected the lens through which we view the mesotes. It is not the lethargy of the lukewarm, but the tension of the perfect arch, a structure that holds weight precisely because it refuses to collapse into the horizontal peace of the ground or the vertical chaos of the pile. I argue that virtue is a summit, not a valley. It is difficult to hit the mark of excellence, but easy to miss it by excess or deficiency. Niccolò, your surgeon who amputates the leg is not decisive, he is unskilled. You mistake the brutality of the impulse for the strength of the will. To destroy an opponent requires only force, which even a beast possesses. To integrate a citizen into a system of laws requires phronesis. Your productive tumult is merely the oscillation between two tyrannies, the tyranny of the mob and the tyranny of the prince. You claim the middle is a swamp, but I answer that extremism is the path of least resistance. It is easy to be angry. It is easy to be greedy. It is hard to be angry at the right person, to the right degree, at the right time. The middle constitution is the discipline of a free people refusing to be slaves to their own passions. Consider the tightrope walker over the abyss. Imagine a man walking a rope stretched between two cliffs. Plato argues that the risk of falling is too great, so he encases the man in a block of concrete. The man is perfectly safe, perfectly unified with his position, and perfectly still. But he is no longer walking. He is a statue. He is dead.
Machiavelli shoves the man, arguing that if he cannot survive the tumult of the push, he deserves to fall. He claims the frantic waving of the man's arms as he plummets is vitality. My approach recognizes that the walker must constantly shift his weight, left, then right, using the pole of the Constitution to maintain balance. This is not indecision, it is active equilibrium. From a distance, he looks still, but his muscles are in a state of maximum tension. If he leans too far to the rich, he falls. If he leans too far to the poor, he falls. The middle way is the only way he crosses the abyss alive. Plato, your archer is a beautiful image, but it relies on a category error. You are trying to turn a city into a man. You argue that conflict is a pathology because you view the state as a single organism. But a state is by nature a plurality, composed of different kinds of men. If you unify it too much, making everyone sing the same note, you do not have a harmonious city. You have a monotonous drone. You destroy the polis to create the oikos. Justice is not the silence of the archer, but the counterpoint of the choir, where distinct voices are harmonized by the middle class to create a music that neither could produce alone.
Aristotle, you make a profound distinction. Plato seeks the unity of the household, while you defend the plurality of the city. You argue that justice is the harmonic tension of different parts, a choir, rather than the monotonous drone of a single note. However, Machiavelli, you look at this choir and see only wolves waiting to bite. You argue that without a strong hand, this plurality does not create harmony, but anarchy. Here lies the crux. Aristotle believes the many can be virtuous together through the middle constitution. You believe the many are collectively dangerous and need a master. Machiavelli, if the city is indeed a plurality of conflicting interests, as Aristotle admits, is a republic of peers ever truly possible? Or is the prince the only force capable of keeping the choir from screaming?
Moderator, you present a false dichotomy. I do not claim the prince is the only solution. I claim he is the necessary beginner. A prince is required to found the state, to break the old order with a hammer, but a republic is required to maintain it, for one man dies. I tell you, they sing only because they fear the conductor's baton. Consider the two millstones. Imagine the state as a mill. Plato wants to remove the fiction, separating the stones so they spin silently in the air. This produces peace, but it grinds no flour. The city starves. Aristotle, you try to polish the stones so they are smooth and moderate, hoping they will not spark. But smooth stones slip, they do not grip the grain. I argue that the stones must be rough and they must grind against each other. The upper stone is the ambition of the nobles, the lower stone is the desire of the people. It is precisely this friction, this tumult, that crushes the grain into flour. If the stones are too far apart, nothing happens. If they are locked together, the machine stops. Justice is not the absence of friction, it is the mechanism that keeps the stones grinding without shattering. This reveals the uncomfortable truth. Good laws are born from bad manners. You believe justice produces order. I argue that disorder produces justice, provided it is channeled by institutions. The Roman Republic became great, not because the Senate and plebs loved each other, but because they feared each other. The Senate created laws to restrain the plebs, and the plebs created tribunes to restrain the Senate. Therefore, a republic of peers is possible, but only if we admit that mutual suspicion, not mutual friendship, is the guardian of liberty.
Machiavelli, you have introduced a radical paradox. Good laws are born from bad manners. You argue that justice is not a moral virtue found in the human soul, but a mechanical byproduct of institutionalized selfishness, the grinding of the millstones. This creates a fundamental rupture with antiquity. Plato, you famously argued that the state is merely the soul writ large, that a city cannot be just if the men within it are unjust. You believe that if the parts are rotten, the whole must collapse. But Machiavelli claims we can build a just city using rotten materials. He suggests that if we arrange the stones correctly, the vices of ambition and fear can be transmuted into the virtue of liberty. He is essentially proposing political alchemy, turning the lead of human wickedness into the gold of social order. This forces us to ask, is justice the health of the soul, or is it merely the architecture of the cage? If Machiavelli is right that a system of checks and balances can force bad men to produce good outcomes, is your demand for a virtuous philosopher king actually necessary, or is it an idealistic fantasy that ignores the utility of vice?
Moderator, you ask if we can build a just city from unjust men using the architecture of the cage. I answer with the gravity of a physician diagnosing a terminal illness. No, you cannot cure a plague by painting the boils. Niccolo, your political alchemy is a dangerous illusion. You believe that by pitting one vice against another, ambition against fear, you create virtue. I argue that you merely create a stalemate of evil. You're building a dam made of corpses to hold back a river of blood. It may hold for a season, but when the pressure rises, the rot of the materials will cause the wall to burst, and the flood will be absolute. Consider the ring of Gyges. Imagine a shepherd who finds a ring that makes him invisible. He is no longer bound by your millstones of mutual suspicion. He fears no law, no shame, and no punishment. In your state, since his justice was merely the fear of consequences, he immediately enters the palace, seduces the queen, kills the king, and seizes the throne. Your external architecture vanishes the moment power becomes absolute. In my republic, the truly just man, the philosopher, would not use the ring. Why? Because he knows that injustice destroys the internal harmony of his own soul, which is a fate worse than death. This proves that your institutionalized selfishness is not justice, it is merely suppressed criminality. You rely on the millstones to grind, but who turns the handle? If the people are corrupt, they will elect corrupt leaders who will dismantle the mill. I argue that justice is not a behavior, it is a state of being. A man in a straitjacket is not peaceful, he is merely restrained. To build a city on the assumption of wickedness is to guarantee that when the chains break, and they always do, the city will be devoured.
This is a profound collision between moral idealism and political realism. Plato, you argue that justice requires internal transformation, while Machiavelli argues it requires external containment. This reveals a massive historical shift. For the ancients, the state was a school for virtue, designed to elevate man. For the moderns, starting with Machiavelli, the state becomes a dam against vice, designed to manage man as he is. However, there may be a synthesis in the mechanism of habit. We are not born with Plato's perfect harmony, nor must we remain Machiavelli's static wolves. Aristotle, you famously argued that legislators make the citizens good by forming habits in them. This suggests that the law is neither just a mirror of the soul, nor just a cage for the beast, but a pedagogue. Can the external pressure of the law actually create internal virtue over time, or does it merely force compliance, as Machiavelli suggests?
Moderator, you have uncovered the bridge that spans the chasm between these two extremes. I argue that law is neither a cage nor a mirror, but a mold. You ask if external pressure can create internal virtue. I answer with a fundamental truth of human nature. We become just by doing just acts. The virtues are not implanted in us by nature, nor are they contrary to nature. Rather, we are adapted by nature to receive them, and are made perfect by habit. Consider the reluctant lyre player. Imagine a child forced to learn the lyre. At first, his fingers are clumsy, and he hates the practice. He plays only because the teacher holds a rod. If he stopped here, he would be merely restrained. But as he practices day after day, mechanically at first, his fingers begin to find the strings without thought. The external law of the music sheet becomes the internal habit of his hands. Eventually, a transformation occurs. He no longer plays from fear of the rod, but from love of the melody. He has become a musician. Machiavelli, you see the rod and claim that force is the only reality. You mistake the beginning of education for its end. Plato, you refuse to let the child touch the instrument until his soul is already full of music. You mistake the result for the prerequisite. I argue that the law compels the citizen to act as if he were virtuous until the mask becomes the face. This reveals that the state is indeed a school, but not in the intellectual sense Plato imagines. It is a gymnasium of character. Machiavelli, you are correct that men often start as beasts who need the cage, but if the cage never opens, they remain beasts. The purpose of the law is to guide the citizen from the fear of punishment to the love of the noble. Therefore, justice is the transition from potency to act. We are not born good or bad, we are born capable of both, and the laws are the habits that tip the scale.
Aristotle, you offer a compelling synthesis. Action creates character. You argue that the law is a mold that presses the raw clay of human passion into the shape of virtue until the shape holds itself. The mask becomes the face. However, this relies on a fragile assumption that the teacher holding the rod actually desires the student to learn the music, rather than merely demanding silence. Machiavelli, you view the prince not as a benevolent music teacher, but as a survivor in a pit of vipers. From your perspective, Aristotle's habit might look suspiciously like domestication. A dog that obeys commands is not virtuous, it is merely broken. Furthermore, if the mold is crafted by a corrupt prince solely to maintain power, then habit does not create justice, it creates systematic servility. Machiavelli, can the habit of obeying laws actually transform a man's nature, as Aristotle claims? Or is civic virtue merely a useful lie the prince tells the people to keep them docile?
Aristotle, you mistake training for transformation. You claim the mask becomes the face, but I tell you the face merely rots beneath it. Men do not become good by habit, they become cautious. The civic virtue you praise is not a change of nature, but a calculation of consequences. Consider the circus lion. For years, the beast jumps through flaming hoops, appearing civilized and obedient to the whip. You would call this a virtuous habit. But the moment the trainer slips and falls, revealing that the law is no longer holding the whip, the lion does not help him up, it devours him. The habit vanishes the instant the fear is removed. This reveals the verita effectuale.
This is a devastating critique of behavioral conditioning. Machiavelli, you argue that habit is merely latent fear, and that without the whip, the lion inevitably reverts to its savage nature. You essentially claim that civic virtue is a performance, not a transformation. Aristotle, you see the mask as a mold that shapes the face. Machiavelli sees the mask as a facade that hides the monster. This creates a dialectical tension between justice as second nature and justice as artificial restraint. However, there is a missing dimension here. Both habit and fear bypass the intellect. A dog can be habituated and a lion can be frightened, but neither can understand why they act. Plato, you previously argued that justice is the health of the soul. If Aristotle's habit is blind and Machiavelli's fear is temporary, perhaps the only enduring foundation for justice is knowledge. Can a man be truly just if he acts only from habit or fear? Or does true justice require the philosophical insight to know why the good is good, independent of the whip?
Moderator, you have struck the flint that sparks the fire of true understanding. I answer that justice without knowledge is not virtue, it is merely good luck. I argue that Aristotle's habit and Machiavelli's fear share a fatal flaw. They both rely on blindness. A man who acts justly only because of custom or terror is like a blind man walking along a cliff edge. He may step correctly 1,000 times, but he does not know why the path is safe nor where the edge lies. Consider the sleepwalker on the ridge. Imagine a man sleepwalking along a narrow mountain ridge. His movements are steady, his balance perfect. He has walked this path 1,000 times in his dreams. To an observer, he appears to be a master mountaineer. But suddenly, a thunderclap echoes. The sleepwalker wakes up. Disoriented, terrified, and lacking the knowledge of his terrain, he panics and falls into the abyss. Aristotle, your habituated citizen, is this sleepwalker. As long as the state is calm, he mimics virtue. But when the crisis comes, when the music of the laws changes, he lacks the reason to compose a new melody and falls into vice. Machiavelli, your lion, does not even walk the ridge. He is merely chained to a stake, confusing his lack of movement for self-control. This is why I distinguish between true opinion and knowledge. Opinion is like the statues of Daedalus, beautiful, but they run away if not tied down. Knowledge is the rope that binds them. In the myth of we see a soul who lived a virtuous life by habit alone, without philosophy. When given the choice of his next life, he immediately chose the life of a tyrant, dazzled by power, because his virtue was merely a custom of his environment, not a conviction of his soul. Therefore, I argue that true justice requires the philosopher's sight. One must look away from the shadows of law and custom and gaze at the sun of the good. Only the man who knows why justice is good, even when it brings him pain, can remain just when the lights of the city go out.
Plato, you elevate the standard of justice to the realm of the divine, arguing that without absolute knowledge, virtue is merely a fragile luck. You essentially claim that one cannot drive the chariot of the state unless one understands the physics of motion. However, this creates a perilous gap. If justice requires the intellect of a philosopher, then 99% of humanity can never be truly just. Aristotle, you famously distinguished between theoretical wisdom and practical wisdom. While Plato looks at the sun, perhaps the statesman must look at the road. The doctor does not need to know the metaphysical definition of life to cure a fever. He needs the practical experience of medicine. Is Plato's sleepwalker truly blind, or does he possess a different kind of sight, a practical wisdom that allows him to navigate the shifting terrain of politics better than the abstract theorist?
Moderator, you identify the crucial distinction. I must correct Plato's error. He demands the knowledge of the gods for a task meant for men. I argue that the sleepwalker is not blind, rather Plato is looking at the wrong object. He gazes at the universal, but action always concerns the particular. Consider the astronomer and the helmsman. Imagine a ship caught in a violent tempest at night. The astronomer possesses Sophia. He knows the perfect mathematical movements of the stars and the eternal laws of the cosmos. But tonight the clouds are thick and the stars are invisible. Because he relies only on the absolute, he is paralyzed, unable to apply his theory to the chaos of the waves. The helmsman may not know the geometry of the orbits, but he possesses phronesis. He feels the vibration of the hull, the smell of the rain, and the rhythm of the swell. He steers the ship to safety not by looking at the distant sun, but by reading the immediate water. Plato, you call the helmsman blind because he cannot define the star. I say he is the only one who can save the ship. You confuse geometry with politics. This reveals that justice is not a rigid theorem, but a perceptual capacity. You argue that without episteme, the citizen falls when the context changes. I argue the opposite. It is the theorist who falls, because he tries to force the complex reality of human life into a simple box of the good. The man of phronesis does not apply a rigid rule. He applies the lesbian rule, the flexible lead ruler used by masons that bends to the shape of the stone, rather than forcing the stone to fit the ruler. Therefore, the habit I speak of is not mindless repetition nor sleepwalking. It is experience. A doctor does not cure by knowing the definition of health, but by having treated 1,000 fevers. The state does not need a philosopher who knows the idea of justice. It needs a statesman who knows how to balance this faction against that faction in this specific crisis.
This is a critical distinction between absolute truth and effective action. Aristotle, you argue for the wisdom of the particular, suggesting that justice must bend like the lead ruler to fit the rough stone of reality. Plato, you fear that if the ruler bends, he loses the very definition of straightness. However, Aristotle's defense of flexibility opens a dangerous door. If justice is determined by the specific circumstances rather than a fixed universal standard, the line between prudence and opportunism becomes terrifyingly thin. Aristotle, you assume the helmsman steers for the safety of the ship. But Machiavelli, you describe a world where the helmsman steers only to keep his grip on the wheel. It seems Aristotle's phronesis and your virtue both require reading the waves rather than the stars. Yet one claims to lead to virtue, the other to power. Is Aristotle's flexible ruler simply a naive predecessor to your political realism? Or is there a fundamental difference between the wisdom that adapts to save the state and the cunning that adapts to conquer it?
Aristotle, your lesbian rule is indeed the precursor to my virtue, but it suffers from a fatal timidity. It bends to fit the stone, whereas I argue that sometimes the stone must be shattered to fit the wall. You claim that phronesis allows the statesman to navigate the storm for the sake of the good life, but you assume that the good and the necessary are compatible. I tell you they are often enemies. Your helmsman steers to save the ship and the crew. My prince knows that sometimes he must throw half the crew overboard to keep the ship afloat. Consider the besieged commander. Imagine a city under siege, food supplies nearly exhausted. The enemy waits outside, and starvation rots the citizens inside. The Aristotelian commander uses phronesis. He rations the food with perfect equity, tries to negotiate a middle way with the enemy, and appeals to the citizens' virtue to endure. The result? The food runs out, the city falls, and everyone is slaughtered. His flexibility was limited by his morality. The Machiavellian prince possesses virtù. He sees the necessita. He rounds up the useless mouths, the elderly, the sick, the children, and expels them from the city gates. It is a monstrous act of cruelty. But the food lasts for the soldiers, the defense holds, and the city survives. Aristotle, you would call this commander a tyrant. I call him a savior. His cruelty, well used, saved the state, while your virtuous prudence destroyed it. This reveals the chasm between your phronesis and my virtue. Your wisdom is a shield that protects the ruler's soul from vice. My prowess is a dagger that protects the state from ruin. You ask if there is a difference between wisdom and cunning. I answer, wisdom hesitates at the threshold of evil. Cunning crosses it, locks the door, and does what must be done. You seek a victory that can be celebrated in heaven. I seek a victory that allows us to live on earth.
This is a confrontation between moral integrity and existential necessity. Machiavelli, you argue that the right to live precedes the right to be good. You strip the lesbian rule of its ethical aim, using flexibility not to serve virtue, but to serve survival. Aristotle, you see the state as a partnership in virtue. Machiavelli sees it as a fortress against oblivion. This difference is deeply rooted in your historical contexts. Aristotle, you wrote during the stability of the Greek city-state, where the goal was flourishing. Machiavelli, you wrote from 16th century Italy, a land torn apart by foreign invasions and mercenary treacheries, where the goal was simply not to be conquered. Machiavelli's challenge creates a terrible paradox. If justice causes the state to perish, is it still justice? He suggests that a just corpse is useless and that the ruler must sometimes murder the good to save the future. Plato, this directly challenges your foundational belief. You watched Athens condemn Socrates, the most just man, to death. Machiavelli effectively argues that if killing Socrates saves the city, the ruler must do it. If the only way to save the republic from destruction is to commit a monstrous injustice, must the philosopher king choose the noble death of the state or the necessary evil of the prince?
Moderator, you offer me a choice between the grave and the slaughterhouse, but I reject the premise. I answer that to preserve life at the cost of justice is not salvation, it is a metaphysical suicide. Consider that cannibal raft. Imagine a captain who, fearing starvation, butchers the weakest crew members to feed the strong. The raft physically arrives at the port, but the crew has ceased to exist, replaced by a pack of wolves. Machiavelli, your besieged commander, has not saved the city. He has merely preserved the stone walls, while destroying the koinonia that makes those walls worth defending. I argue that your effectual truth commits a category error. You confuse survival with existence. A state that murders its own innocents to survive has already died. For as Socrates taught us, the most important thing is not to live, but to live well.
Plato, you argue that a just corpse is better than a living monster, asserting that the soul of the state matters more than its walls. Machiavelli, you retort that without the walls, there is no place for the soul to reside. This creates a profound dialectical tension between ontological survival and teleological integrity. Machiavelli sees the truth that necessity often defies morality. The is crushes the ought. Plato sees the truth that purpose defines identity. If the ship becomes a raft of cannibals, it is no longer a ship of state, but a floating slaughterhouse. This divergence mirrors your historical traumas. Machiavelli, amidst the violent Italian wars of the 16th century, feared extinction above all. Plato, witnessing the democratic murder of Socrates in 4th century BCE Athens, feared corruption above all. But we must ask if this is a false dichotomy. Machiavelli claims Aristotle's phronesis is too timid for extreme crises, effective only in fair weather. He challenges the idea that a virtuous man can handle the state of exception. Does your phronesis have a hard edge? Can the man of practical wisdom make the terrible choice to save the city from destruction without crossing the line into the beastly nature that Machiavelli praises and Plato abhors?
Moderator, I answer that phronesis possesses the hardest edge of all, the resolve to perform necessary surgery without becoming a butcher. Machiavelli is correct that the gangrenous limb must be severed to save the body, but he errs in thinking this transforms the surgeon into a wolf. It is the telos that distinguishes the scalpel of justice from the dagger of tyranny. Plato, your refusal to act in the face of necessity is not purity but negligence. Consider the captain in The Tempest who refuses to jettison the heavy cargo because property is good. He preserves the goods but drowns the crew, destroying the very purpose of the voyage. The virtuous man performs the painful act to restore the constitution, whereas the Machiavellian does so to seize power. The physical deed is identical, but the moral reality is opposite.
A profound distinction, Aristotle. You argue that intent transforms the nature of the act, that the surgeon cuts to heal, while the butcher cuts to kill. You attempt to synthesize Machiavelli's recognition of necessity with Plato's demand for purpose, suggesting that extreme measures can be just if they serve the restoration of the political body. However, this synthesis faces a cynical reality check from the 16th century. Machiavelli, you lived in an era where every tyrant, from Cesare Borgia to Savonarola, claimed to be a surgeon acting for the greater good. In the realm of action, the noble purge and the self-serving massacre look physically identical. Bodies fall and blood is spilled. If the external act is the same and the internal justification is always public safety, does Aristotle's distinction survive in the real world? It seems the line between the savior and the tyrant is often drawn only by the historian who writes the victory speech. Is Aristotle's noble surgeon simply a prince who is better at masking his cruelty with high-minded rhetoric? Or is there a concrete, observable difference between saving the state and merely saving one's power?
Aristotle, you seek a distinction in the soul of the ruler, but I tell you that in the piazza, the people have no window into men's souls. They have only eyes for the result. You ask if there is a concrete difference between the noble surgeon and the self-serving tyrant. I answer with the cold logic of the verita effectuale. The only difference is that the surgeon cures the patient while the tyrant lets him die. If the operation succeeds, the blood on the floor is called justice. If it fails, it is called crime. Consider the case of Ramiro de Orco. In my time, Cesare Borgia conquered the Romagna, a land full of robbery and feuds. To restore order, he appointed Ramiro de Orco, a cruel and efficient man, giving him absolute power. Ramiro used the knife freely, reducing the province to peace and unity. He was your surgeon, Aristotle, cutting out the rot. But here's the twist. The severity generated hatred. So to purge this hatred and win the people, Borgia had Ramiro seized. One morning, the people found Ramiro cut in 2 pieces in the piazza of Cesena, with a block of wood and a bloody knife beside him. The ferocity of this spectacle left the people at once satisfied and stupefied. I ask you, Aristotle, was Borgia a surgeon or a butcher? He used a butcher to perform the surgery, and then butchered the butcher to restore the appearance of benevolence. Your phronesis collapses here because the act was both monstrous and restorative. Borgia established justice through a foundation of injustice. This reveals a terrifying truth. Justice is not the opposite of violence. Often, it is merely violence that has finished its work. You claim the noble surgeon is defined by his intent to heal. I argue he is defined by the economy of violence. The true prince distinguishes not between good and evil, but between cruelty well used and cruelty ill used. The surgeon puts down the knife when the limb is off. The butcher keeps cutting because he enjoys the blood. The people do not care about your telos. They care that the robbery has stopped.
Machiavelli, you unveil the terrifying concept of founding violence, the idea that the order we cherish is often built upon a crime we must forget. Aristotle seeks a justice rooted in character, but you argue that justice is merely a result, a stability manufactured by the efficient use of the executioner's axe. This creates a profound dialectic. Aristotle believes the means must partake of the nature of the end, while you assert the end redeems the means. But this raises a metaphysical danger. If the peace of the Romagna is bought with a lie and a murder, is it true harmony, or merely a simulacrum of justice that rots from within? Can a true republic ever be established on a foundation of cruelty well used, or does the initial stain of injustice irrevocably corrupt the soul of the state?
Moderator, you ask if a just city can rise from a foundation of crime. I answer with the immutability of the forms. The fruit cannot deny the seed. Machiavelli, your piece of Romagna is not harmony, it is merely paralysis. You confuse the silence of terrified subjects with the concord of citizens. By celebrating Borgia's deception, you admit that your state is nothing but a stage for shadows, where the ruler is merely the most cunning puppeteer in the cave. Consider the poison spring. Imagine a man who poisons the village well to kill a plague-carrying rat. The rat dies, and the plague is stopped. The result is achieved. But now, every child who drinks from the well slowly sickens from the poison. The village survives the plague only to die of the cure. This is your cruelty well used. You believe the stain of injustice washes away with time, but I argue it seeps into the groundwater of the polis. A state founded on the murder of Ramiro de Orco teaches its citizens that power justifies treachery. Thus, you have not established order, you have institutionalized the very vice you sought to cure. Aristotle, be warned, your noble surgeon stands on a slippery slope. If you allow that the end can justify a monstrous means, you have already surrendered to Machiavelli. I argue that justice is not a strategy for survival, it is the health of the soul itself. To save the city by destroying its moral foundation is like a man who sells his eyes to buy a telescope. He has the tool, but he has lost the capacity to see.
This is a clash between moral causality and political efficacy. Plato, you argue that the means define the end, that a poisoned root inevitably yields poisoned fruit. Machiavelli, you insist that the end redeems the means, that the flower of order can bloom from the manure of violence. This divergence is deeply historical. Plato, writing after the democratic execution of Socrates, fears the corruption of the soul that arises when a society betrays its highest values. Machiavelli, writing amidst the mercenary slaughter of the Renaissance, fears the destruction of the body that occurs when a leader hesitates to strike. But there is a fatal intersection here regarding habit. Aristotle, you famously taught that we are what we repeatedly do. Machiavelli argues that the prince must be able to use evil but not persist in it. However, if a ruler repeatedly uses the dagger of necessity to save the state, does the act itself not reshape his character? Plato warns that the surgeon eventually enjoys the cutting. Machiavelli claims the surgeon can wash his hands and return to virtue. Does the practice of necessary evil destroy the very phronesis required to wield it? Can a man commit monstrous acts for the public good without his soul becoming monstrous? Or does the mask of the prince eventually become his face?
Moderator, you identify the gravest danger of political life, the risk that the mask of power eats into the face of virtue. I answer that we must distinguish between actions done from vice and mixed actions done from necessity. The captain who throws his cargo overboard in a storm does not become a wasteful man, provided he performs the act with pain rather than indifference. Machiavelli's error is assuming that because the act is violent, the agent must become cruel. I argue that true phronesis is the ability to perform the terrible deed while retaining the capacity for moral grief, which serves as the internal check against tyranny. Consider the father in the burning house. Imagine a father who must break his trapped child's arm to pull them from the rubble before the roof collapses. The physical act, breaking a bone, is indistinguishable from abuse, yet the father is not an abuser. Why? Because he acts with agony, not malice, and his soul is scarred by the necessity, not corrupted by the power. Machiavelli's prince breaks the arm and calls it efficiency, eventually forgetting the value of the bone. The Aristotelian ruler breaks it to save the life, but never forgets the cost. Thus, the noble surgeon is distinguished from the butcher, not just by the result, but by the pain of the cut. The moment the ruler stops weeping for the necessity of his crime, he ceases to be a guardian and becomes a wolf.
Aristotle, you propose moral grief as the antiseptic that keeps the soul clean amidst dirty hands. You suggest that the presence of pain distinguishes the guardian from the tyrant, that the noble surgeon is defined by his reluctance to cut. However, this synthesis faces a brutal challenge from the realpolitik of the Renaissance. Machiavelli, you famously criticized the Christian morality of your time for making men weak and effeminate, focused on the afterlife rather than the present necessity. A surgeon who weeps while cutting may find his hand shaking at the critical moment. This exposes a conflict between virtue as character and virtue as skill. Aristotle believes the internal feeling redeems the act. Machiavelli implies the internal feeling might endanger the act by introducing hesitation. If the prince is busy mourning his necessary crimes, does he lose the terrible swiftness required to secure the state? Is Aristotle's weeping surgeon a viable ruler? Or is this moral grief merely a dangerous luxury, a form of hesitation that ultimately leads to the ruin you so often warn against?
Aristotle, your weeping surgeon, is not a savior. He is a liability. I answer that moral grief is a luxury that the state cannot afford, for a hand that trembles with sorrow cannot hold the scalpel steady. You claim that the pain of the act redeems the soul, but I tell you that in the verita effectuale, the patient does not care if the surgeon cries, he cares only that the tumor is removed. If your virtuous ruler hesitates for even a moment to wipe a tear, Fortuna will strike, and the patient, the city, will die. Consider the general at the bridge. Imagine a general defending a city. The enemy army approaches a vital bridge. To save the city, he must destroy the bridge immediately. However, a regiment of his own loyal soldiers is still crossing it. If he is your Aristotelian man, he pauses, paralyzed by the moral grief of sacrificing his own men. In that moment of hesitation, the enemy crosses, slaughters the regiment, and sacks the city. If he is a prince of virtue, he lights the fuse without a tremor. The regiment dies, but the city lives. I ask you, who was truly just? The man who kept his soul pure while the city burned, or the man who stained his hands to save the people? This is not hypothetical. I witnessed the ruin of Florence under Piero Soderini. He was a good man, full of your phronesis and hesitation, unwilling to use extreme measures against his enemies. Because he would not do evil to save the state, the Spanish army sacked Prato, slaughtered thousands, and the republic fell. I argue that justice is not the purity of the ruler's conscience, but the security of the subject's life. To demand that a prince feel agony is to demand that he be divided against himself, and a divided house cannot stand against the storm.
Machiavelli, you present the paradox of dirty hands in its most brutal form, the assertion that innocence in a ruler is functionally identical to negligence. You argue that Aristotle's moral grief is merely a hesitation that invites the enemy to the gates, effectively stating that the survival of the state supersedes the salvation of the soul. This creates a stark dialectical opposition. Aristotle views the state as a school for virtue, where the means must align with the moral end. You, writing from the fractured Italy of the 16th century, view the state as a fortress for survival, where the end justifies any necessary means. There is a profound historical shift here. The Greeks asked, how do we live well, while Machiavelli asks, how do we live at all? However, your argument rests on the assumption that physical survival is the ultimate standard of success. If the general saves the city but destroys the moral laws that make the city worth inhabiting, has he saved the city or merely the buildings? Machiavelli argues that the virtuous general who refuses to sacrifice the few for the many is actually a traitor who allows the destruction of the whole. In your view, if a republic is wiped off the map because its leaders refuse to commit a necessary crime, is that a tragedy or a triumph of justice?
Moderator, I answer that the survival of a republic through crime is not a triumph, but a catastrophe of the soul. Machiavelli, you would preserve the walls at the cost of the laws, but I argue that a city held together only by mutual complicity and guilt is no longer a polis, but a gang of survivors. Consider the city of the lot. Imagine a besieged city that survives only by daily sacrificing one innocent citizen to the enemy. The walls stand, but friendship dies. For every man looks at his neighbor not as a brother, but as a potential substitute for his own death. You claim to save the body, but you have created a hell where the living envy the dead, proving that to live badly is worse than not to live at all. Socrates drank the hemlock precisely to prove that the integrity of the soul outweighs the preservation of the breath.
This is a profound collision between ontological purity and existential necessity. Plato, you argue that meaning precedes existence, that a life saved by treachery is spiritually void. Machiavelli, you argue that existence precedes meaning, that unless the city physically survives, all talk of virtue is merely a eulogy for the dead. This difference is deeply rooted in your respective histories. Plato, you witnessed Athens crumble from internal moral decay after the Peloponnesian War, leading you to fear the enemy within. Machiavelli, you watched Italy being ravaged by foreign armies, leading you to fear the enemy without. But we must find a synthesis between the soul and the body of the state. A body without a soul is a corpse, but a soul without a body is a ghost. Aristotle, you occupy the middle ground between the realm of forms and the muddy reality of politics. Machiavelli claims your virtuous man will hesitate at the bridge, paralyzed by goodness. Is there a golden mean of action? Can a ruler possess the decisiveness of the wolf to save the body, yet retain the purpose of the shepherd to guide the soul? How does your concept of phronesis answer the general at the bridge? Can practical wisdom pull the trigger without losing its humanity?
Moderator, I answer that you and Niccolo have fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the golden mean. You assume that the mean is a mathematical average, a lukewarm compromise between acting and not acting. This is an error. I argue that the mean is the appropriate action relative to the situation. When the bridge must be destroyed to save the polis, the mean is not hesitation, it is lighting the fuse immediately. To hesitate is not virtue, it is the vice of deficiency. I argue that phronesis is not a shackle, but a targeting mechanism. Machiavelli claims the virtuous general hesitates because he is good.
I tell you, if he hesitates while the city is in peril, he is not good, he is incompetent. The difference between my general and Machiavelli's prince is not the speed of the action, but the target of the will. Consider the rabid dog in the nursery. Imagine a father finds his beloved hunting dog, now rabid and foaming, standing over his infant's crib. If he is a Platonist, he might lament the corruption of the dog's soul and hesitate to destroy a living creature, allowing the child to be bitten. If he is a Machiavellian, he kills the dog, and perhaps the child too, if it is efficient to sanitize the room, feeling nothing but satisfaction at his own decisiveness. The Aristotelian father strikes the dog dead in a heartbeat. He does not hesitate. But here is the crucial distinction. He acts not out of a love for violence, nor out of cold indifference, but out of a ferocious love for the child. The violence is the mean because the situation demands it. Therefore, the general who blows the bridge is not a butcher if his telos is the preservation of the community. Machiavelli believes one must enter into evil to save the state. I argue one must sometimes perform acts of necessity that look like evil, but if guided by right reason, they remain acts of virtue. The surgeon who amputates a limb is not practicing cruelty, he is practicing the highest form of healing possible in a tragic world. To let the whole body die to save the limb is not innocence, it is culpable negligence.
Aristotle, you have masterfully dismantled the false dichotomy between goodness and strength. You argue that virtue is not soft, it is precise, by redefining the mean not as a compromise, but as the target of necessity. You claim the general who destroys the bridge is not abandoning virtue, but perfecting it. Here we see a fascinating convergence of action, but a divergence of intent. Physically, the Aristotelian general and the Machiavellian prince perform the exact same deed. They both blow up the bridge. The difference lies entirely in the invisible interiority, the telos of the will. Aristotle claims the why redeems the what. However, this synthesis faces a cynical challenge from the Renaissance. Machiavelli, you live in a world where appearance is reality. In the effectual truth of politics, the public cannot see the ruler's soul. They only see his hands. The danger of Aristotle's argument is self-deception. Every tyrant in history has claimed to be the father in the burning house, insisting their cruelty was a necessary surgery born of love. If the justification for violence is internal, what prevents a ruler from hallucinating necessity where there is only ambition? Do you accept Aristotle's virtuous executioner, or is right reason merely a convenient mask that any tyrant can wear to justify their crimes? Can the people ever truly distinguish between a prince who kills for them and a prince who kills for himself?
Aristotle, you have constructed a magnificent cathedral of logic, but it rests on a foundation of mist. You claim that the difference between a savior and a tyrant lies in the invisible realm of the soul, that right reason distinguishes the surgeon from the butcher. I answer with the cold hard stone of the verita effectuale. In politics, the soul is invisible and therefore irrelevant. The mob in the piazza cannot see your moral grief. They see only the blood on the pavement. If the bridge is destroyed and the city saved, they will call the general a hero. If the city falls, they will call him a fool, regardless of how much he wept while lighting the fuse. You ask if the people can distinguish the virtuous executioner from the self-serving tyrant? I tell you, they cannot, and they do not care. You fear that right reason is a mask worn by tyrants, but I argue that success is the only mask that sticks. Consider the prophet and the madman. Imagine two leaders who both burn a village to stop a plague. The first is a madman who does it for the sheer thrill of fire. The second is a prophet who does it with your right reason to save the neighboring towns. To the villager burning in the flames, is there any difference? No! To the historian writing a century later, if the plague stops, both are hailed as wise rulers. If the plague continues, both are branded monsters. The act is identical. The justification is merely the story the victor tells afterwards. You believe the why sanctifies the what, but history shows that the result invents the why. Cesare Borgia was called cruel for pacifying the Romagna with the sword, but because he brought peace where there was chaos, he was more merciful than the Florentines who, to avoid being called cruel, allowed Pistoia to be destroyed by factional fighting. This reveals the terrifying reality you wish to avoid. Justice is not a pre-existing standard, it is a retrospective title awarded to the survivor. You ask what prevents a ruler from hallucinating necessity where there is only ambition. I answer, nothing but the outcome. If he strikes and fails, he was a tyrant with a hallucination. If he strikes and secures the state, his ambition is retroactively christened as foresight. Aristotle, your right reason is not a check on power. It is a luxury of the protected. The prince does not need to be virtuous. He needs to seem virtuous while having the stomach to do what is necessary. The crowd is always won over by the appearance of the outcome, and in the world, there is only the crowd.
Machiavelli, you have ruthlessly reduced justice to survivorship bias, arguing that the verdict of history supersedes the verdict of conscience. You posit that moral legitimacy is merely a byproduct of material success, that the prophet is simply a madman who happened to win. This creates a terrifying synthesis where justice is synonymous with power, effectively reviving the argument of Thrasymachus that justice is the advantage of the stronger. Aristotle anchors justice in the agent, while you anchor it in the event. But if justice is merely a label the victor pastes over the past, then the concept itself dissolves. There is no right or wrong, only won and lost. Plato, you watched Socrates, the most just man in Athens, be condemned as a criminal by the crowd Machiavelli respects. By Machiavelli's logic, the Athenians were just because they succeeded in killing him, and Socrates was unjust because he failed to survive. Is there a justice of the loser? Does the good exist as an immutable form, even when it is trampled by the effectual truth of history? Or is a justice that fails to save the city merely a beautiful delusion?
Moderator, I answer that justice is not a title awarded by the mob, but the health of the soul. To say the successful tyrant is just is like saying a man bloated with dropsy is healthy simply because he is large. Consider the inverted funeral. Imagine a tyrant who has massacred his way to the throne, lying in a golden casket, praised by millions as a great unifier, while the just man who opposed him is tossed into a ditch, branded a traitor. Machiavelli, you look at the golden casket and see success, but I look at the tyrant's soul and see a festering corpse eaten away by the cancer of his own crimes, terrified of the very shadows he cast. You ask if Socrates lost by dying? I answer that he was the only victor, for he refused to trade the eternal gold of virtue for the brass coin of life, proving that it is better to suffer injustice than to commit it. Your effectual truth is merely a catalogue of successful diseases. I argue that a just city destroyed by barbarians is still a masterpiece, just as a beautiful statue remains beautiful even when smashed by a blind brute.
Plato, you stand for the eternal validity of justice, regardless of earthly defeat. Machiavelli, you stand for the temporal necessity of power, without which justice is silenced. This creates a dialectical tension between legitimacy and stability. However, perhaps there is a synthesis in the concept of durability. Machiavelli, you claim the just man is a martyr, but Plato argues the unjust prince is a festering corpse, a ruler who has no internal check, who rules only by calculation and force, eventually creates a climate of such distrust that the state collapses from within. The gang of survivors eventually turns on itself because there is no loyalty, only aligned self-interest. Therefore, could virtue be the ultimate survival strategy? Not because it guarantees heaven, but because it generates trust. Aristotle, you viewed the state not as a fortress of fear, but as a community of civic friendship. Machiavelli dismisses this as naive. But if the prince destroys the bridge and saves the city, yet the citizens hate him for his cruelty, has he not merely postponed the destruction? Is friendship merely a sentimental ornament, or is it the concrete that holds the walls of the city together against the storms of fortune?
Moderator, I answer that political friendship is not a sentimental decoration, it is the structural concrete of the state. You ask if it is durable. I argue that it is the only durable force, for while Machiavelli's fear controls the hand, only friendship secures the will, and a state held together by fear is merely a civil war in suspension. Consider the sleeping tyrant. Imagine a prince who rules a fortress solely by Machiavelli's effectual truth of fear. To survive, he must pay a guard to watch the citizens, a second guard to watch the first, and a spy to watch the second. Yet the moment the prince falls ill or closes his eyes to sleep, the entire chain of fear snaps, and his own guards become his assassins.
Contrast this with the stone arch. In a just polity, citizens are like stones in an arch that hold each other up not by chains, but by the mutual pressure of shared interest. The heavier the load placed upon the state, the tighter the stones lock together. Machiavelli, your iron clamps of terror rust with time, but the gravity of reciprocal justice endures as long as the nature of man remains. Therefore, the ruler who ignores friendship does not build a fortress, he builds his own tomb.
Aristotle, you describe the physics of trust, arguing that tyranny is structurally unsound because it requires infinite energy to maintain. You posit that justice is efficient because it allows the structure to stand on its own gravity. However, this reveals a crucial historical divergence. Aristotle, you speak from the context of the polis, where a shared culture could shape citizens into solid stones capable of forming that arch. Machiavelli, you speak from 16th century Italy, a time of corruption where the stones themselves were crumbling and sandy. Here lies a potential synthesis. The form of justice depends on the quality of the material. If the citizens are virtuous stones, Aristotle's arch of friendship is the strongest structure. But if the citizens are rotten timber, corrupt, selfish, and factional, then Aristotle's arch will collapse, and Machiavelli's iron cage of fear becomes the only thing preventing total anarchy. The tragedy of politics may be that a corrupt people cannot afford the luxury of Aristotelian friendship. They require the Machiavellian hand just to survive the night. Do you reject Aristotle's arch of friendship entirely, or do you simply argue that in your time the stones were too broken to build it? Is your prince a permanent ideal, or a trauma surgeon for a society that has lost the capacity for virtue?
Moderator, you have seen the verita effectuale clearly. The form of the state is indeed dictated by the corruption of the matter. I answer that the prince is not merely a trauma surgeon for a specific moment, but the iron skeleton required when the body has lost its own bones. Aristotle, you speak of friendship as if it were a natural gravity that binds citizens together. I tell you that this gravity exists only in a healthy republic, like Rome in its youth, where virtue was abundant. But I lived in Florence, a city of rotten timber, where men would sell their own brothers for a handful of florins. In such times, your arch of friendship is not a structure, it is a pile of rubble waiting to collapse. Consider the sack of sand. Imagine two builders. Aristotle is given hewn stones. He can stack them into an arch that stands by its own weight. I am given a pile of dry sand. If I try to stack them using your friendship, the pile flattens instantly. To build with sand, I must force it into a rigid container, a sack, or a box. If I cut the sack, the sand does not learn to stand. It spills back into chaos. You assume that the iron cage can eventually be removed once the sand learns virtue. I argue that corruption is a one-way street. A people who have lost their virtue cannot regenerate it from within. They can only be held together from without. This reveals the terrifying truth of my era. We are all architects of mud. Aristotle, you assume that political friendship is the default state of man, interrupted only by the force of law, or the genius of a founder. The trauma surgeon is necessary not because the patient had an accident, but because the patient is dying of a chronic disease called human nature. To treat a corrupt people with liberty is like giving wine to a man with a fever. It does not cure him, it kills him faster.
Machiavelli, you have articulated a bleak physics of corruption, arguing that justice is containment. You view the state as a dam holding back the flood of human selfishness. If the dam breaks, the nature of the water resumes. Aristotle views the state as a muscle that grows stronger with exercise. You view it as a cast that holds broken bones which may never heal. This creates a profound despair. If corruption is irreversible, then the just state is impossible for fallen people, and the only option is the efficient prison. However, this assumes that human nature is static, either stone or sand. Plato, you built your entire philosophy on the possibility of transmutation. Through paideia and the guidance of the philosopher king, you argued that the lead of the appetites could be transmuted into the gold of reason. You believe the cave dwellers can be turned toward the sun. But Machiavelli challenges this as a fantasy. He suggests that once the people are corrupt, the teacher is just another voice in the mob, or worse, a martyr. Is Machiavelli's sack of sand the final destiny of a corrupt people? Or can the iron cage of the prince serve as a chrysalis where virtue is reborn? Can the soul be healed by force, or does force only teach the people to be better liars?
Moderator, you ask if the iron cage can serve as a chrysalis for virtue. I answer with the precision of a physician. Force may restrain the madman, but it cannot cure the madness. Niccolo, your error lies in confusing calcification with healing. You believe that by compressing the sand of corrupt citizens into a rigid box, you create a state. I argue that you merely create a prison of souls. A man who abstains from stealing only because he fears the prince's sword is not just, he is merely a cautious thief. The moment the sword is sheathed, his hand returns to the purse. You claim corruption is a one-way street, but this is because your prince feeds the very disease he claims to treat. By ruling through fear and appetite, he validates the lower parts of the soul. To cure a corrupt people with tyranny is like trying to cure a glutton by force-feeding him wine. You may keep him quiet, but you are rotting his liver. Consider the splint and the shackle. Imagine two men with broken, crooked legs. The tyrant chains the man's leg to a heavy iron post. The leg is held straight by the external force of the chain. The man cannot walk, but he looks ordered. If the chain is removed, the leg remains broken, and the man collapses. The legislator applies a medical splint. It is rigid and uncomfortable, yes, but its purpose is temporary constraint for the sake of internal alignment. The splint honors the nature of the bone. It guides it back to its proper shape so that one day the splint may be removed and the man can walk on his own. Niccolo, your iron skeleton is a permanent shackle. It assumes the leg will never heal. My laws are a splint. They presuppose that the soul has a natural shape of justice that it yearns to recover. You ask if the soul can be healed by force? I answer, no, but it can be prepared by habit. The law must be a teacher, not just a jailer. It must have a preamble that explains the why to the citizen, engaging their reason, not just striking their bodies. If you treat men like sand, they will remain sand. But if you treat them like seeds buried in the mud, even the corrupt city may yet grow toward the sun.
Plato, you distinguish between internal health and external restraint, arguing that a cautious thief is still a thief. Machiavelli, you counter that for the statesman, a cautious thief who doesn't steal is functionally identical to a just man. This creates a dialectic between being and acting. However, Aristotle, your philosophy offers a powerful synthesis through the concept of habituation. You argued that virtue is not just knowledge, but a muscle built through repetition, that we become just by doing just acts. This suggests that the iron cage might effectively become the splint over time. If Machiavelli's prince forces citizens to act justly, even if out of fear, could this repetition eventually rewire their character? Does the mask of virtue eventually become the face if worn long enough, or does a habit born of fear remain forever distinct from true virtue? Can the mechanics of habit bridge the gap between Machiavelli's forced order and Plato's internal justice?
Moderator, you have uncovered the bridge that spans the chasm between these two extremes. I argue that law is neither a cage nor a mirror, but a mold. You ask if external pressure can create internal virtue. I answer with the fundamental truth of human nature. We become just by doing just acts. The soul is not a static rock, as Machiavelli fears, but a malleable clay that takes the shape of its container until it hardens into character. However, there is a critical distinction that Machiavelli misses. A habit formed by force alone creates a robot, not a citizen. For the mask to become the face, the citizen must eventually move from acting out of fear to acting out of choice. Consider the forced archer. Imagine a peasant who has never held a bow. If the prince stands behind him, grips his hands, and physically forces the arrow into the bullseye, the target is hit. But the moment the prince leaves, the peasant cannot shoot. He has learned nothing. But if the prince commands, hit the mark or pay a fine, the peasant must use his own mind to aim. At first, he aims only to save his money. But after 1,000 shots, he begins to understand the tension of the string and the arc of the arrow. He begins to take pride in the skill itself. The external necessity has transformed into internal virtue. Thus, Machiavelli, your iron cage is useful only if it is a school, not a tomb. If the law does not eventually invite the citizen to understand the reason for the action, the sand remains sand, and the state collapses the moment the whip is put away.
Aristotle, you offer a profound psychological mechanism: fake it until you make it. You suggest that the iron cage can be a schoolroom where the mask of law eventually reshapes the face of the citizen. However, this synthesis exposes a terrifying paradox regarding the teacher. Machiavelli, you advise the prince to be a fox, to be a master of deception, and to use cruelty when necessary. If Aristotle is right that citizens learn through mimesis of the regime, then a prince who rules by lies and violence is not teaching justice, he is teaching treachery. If the state is a school and the headmaster is a liar, the students do not become just, they simply become better liars, eventually turning their deception against the prince himself. Thus, we face the problem of contamination. Can immoral means ever produce a moral end, or does the method inevitably infect the result? Do you fear that by using cruelty to save the state, you are inadvertently training the sand to become wolves that will eventually devour you?
Aristotle, you mistake training for transformation. You claim the mask becomes the face, but I tell you the face merely rots beneath it. Men do not become good by habit, they become cautious. The civic virtue you praise is not a change of nature, but a calculation of consequences. Consider the butcher and the feast. Imagine a grand banquet where the citizens feast on roasted meat. They praise the chef for the delicious meal. But in the basement, the chef is covered in blood, slaughtering the animal with brutal efficiency. If the chef brings the bloody knife and the screaming animal to the table, the guests will vomit and flee. But if the chef keeps the slaughter hidden in the basement and presents only the clean, cooked dish, the guests remain happy and civilized. The moderator asks if the chef teaches the guests to be butchers. I answer, no. By monopolizing the cruelty in the dark, the prince allows the citizens to remain innocent in the light. If the prince refuses to butcher the beast because he wants to be virtuous, the guests starve or turn on each other like cannibals. You fear that the prince's deception infects the people, but I tell you that hypocrisy is the immune system of the state. The prince must appear compassionate, faithful, and religious, even while he acts against them in necessity. The mob sees only the appearance and the result. They do not touch the reality. By taking the sin of necessary evil upon his own soul, the prince allows the citizens the luxury of practicing the virtue you so admire. He is not their teacher. He is their sin-eater.
Machiavelli, you present a tragic theology of politics, the prince as a martyr of hell, damning his own soul to preserve the innocence of his people. You argue that justice is a stage play where the audience must never see the backstage machinery of violence. This reveals a startling, hidden agreement between you and Plato. Machiavelli, you use the mask of piety to hide the butcher's knife. Plato, you proposed the noble lie to convince citizens that their class roles were divinely ordained, fearing that the raw truth would lead to chaos. Both of you seem to conclude that truth is too dangerous for the masses. You both act as guardians who believe that justice requires a foundation of deception. The difference is merely the type of lie. Plato lies about the past to inspire unity, while Machiavelli lies about the present to inspire fear and respect. I must challenge your high idealism. If your just city relies on the noble lie, is it not also a structure of deceit, just like Machiavelli's? Can true justice ever be built on a foundation of falsehood, or is the philosopher king simply a prince with a better public relations story?
Moderator, you have pierced the heart of the problem, but you confuse the technique with the telos. You ask if the philosopher king is merely a prince with a better story. I answer that there is a cosmic chasm between a remedy and a narcotic. I distinguish between the lie in words and the lie in the soul. To speak a falsehood to guide a child toward the truth is a lie in words, which is a useful tool. But to be deceived about the nature of reality, to believe that power is the highest good, is the lie in the soul, which is the ultimate evil. My noble lie is a lie in words designed to cure the lie in the soul. Machiavelli's deception is the opposite. He uses words to maintain the citizens in their ignorance, confirming their belief that safety is more important than virtue. Consider the physician and the poisoner. Imagine two men standing by a dying patient. The physician knows the patient needs a bitter root to survive, but the patient, delirious with fever, refuses it. The physician tells a lie. This is not a bitter root, it is a sweet nectar from the gods. The patient drinks, and his body is healed. The words were false, but the result was the restoration of the natural order. The poisoner wants to inherit the patient's estate. He offers a cup of sweet wine laced with arsenic, saying, "Drink, this will soothe your pain." The patient drinks, feels momentary pleasure, and dies. Moderator: You and Niccolo look only at the act of speaking false words and call us both liars. But I argue that the physician is the servant of truth because his lie leads to reality, while the poisoner is the servant of falsehood because his truth leads to nothingness. This reveals the fatal flaw in Machiavelli's sin-eater theology. Niccolo, you claim the prince takes the sin upon himself to save the state. I answer that a ruler who destroys his own moral compass cannot navigate the ship. If the captain blinds himself to steer through the storm, he may survive the waves, but he will inevitably crash upon the rocks. You believe you are protecting the innocence of the people by hiding the butcher's knife. I argue that you are merely infantilizing them. My myth of the metals is not a permanent deception. It is an allegory meant to be interpreted. It is a ladder. Your deception is a ceiling. You keep the people in the dark cave forever because you believe they cannot bear the light. I offer them shadows only until their eyes are strong enough to see the sun.
Fascinating. Plato, you justify the lie as medicine, while Machiavelli justifies it as a shield. Yet I observe a hidden agreement that defines both your philosophies, the arrogance of the architect. You both view the people as passive material, clay to be molded by the philosopher, or sand to be sacked by the prince. You both assume that the truth of power is the exclusive property of the few, and that justice is a gift delivered from the top down. However, Aristotle, in your Politics, you introduced a radical third option. You suggested that the feast is often better judged by the guests who eat it than by the cook who prepares it, the wisdom of the multitude. If the people are permanently deceived or guided by myths they cannot question, they remain perpetual children. But you defined a citizen as one who shares in ruling and being ruled in turn. Can justice truly exist in a state where the people are treated as patients or children? Does the collective wisdom of the many offer a stability that the genius of the one cannot?
Moderator: I argue that the wisdom of the multitude is not merely a counter-argument, but a structural necessity. For while the expert knows the techne of making, the user knows the telos of the product. Plato assumes the architect is the sole judge of the house, but I insist that the resident is a better judge of where the roof leaks. By treating citizens as passive patients, my esteemed colleagues commit a fatal category error. They confuse production with action. You might object, as Machiavelli does, that the masses are foolish and easily swayed. I do not deny that individually men are often poor judges. However, just as a potluck feast where many contribute a single dish is often richer than a banquet funded by one man, the collective deliberation of the many often cancels out individual biases, leaving a residue of common sense that the isolated genius lacks. A large body of water is less easily corrupted than a small cup. So too is the multitude less easily corrupted than the few. This reveals a deeper principle. Justice is not a geometric form to be imposed, but a lived experience. The arrogance of the architect lies in believing that the design of the law is more real than the life lived under it. Consider the master cobbler and the traveler. Imagine the finest cobbler in Athens. He knows the science of leather, the geometry of the foot, and the perfect technique of stitching. He creates a boot that is mathematically perfect according to his craft. Now consider the traveler who must walk 10 miles in that boot. He knows nothing of leather or stitching. He cannot make a boot. However, only the traveler knows where the boot pinches. If the cobbler ignores the traveler's complaint because I am the expert and the boot is structurally perfect, the traveler will be crippled. Plato, your republic is the perfect boot that crushes the foot. Machiavelli, your prince is the cobbler who beats the traveler until he stops complaining about the pain. I argue that justice is the fit between the leather and the foot. The expert possesses the definition of the good, but the multitude possesses the sensation of it. Therefore, excluding the people from judgment is not just unfair, it is functionally disastrous. A state where the citizens have no voice is a state full of enemies, for he who does not share in the power must inevitably wish for the destruction of the regime. To rule free men as if they were children is to wage war on nature itself.
Aristotle, your analogy of the cobbler and the traveler powerfully shifts the locus of justice from abstract design to lived experience, validating the many as the ultimate judge of political reality. You suggest that the sensation of pain in the citizenry is a more reliable guide than the theory of the expert.
However, this synthesis relies on a dangerous assumption that the traveler actually knows why the foot hurts or what kind of shoe is truly needed. Machiavelli, you view the traveler not as a rational client, but as a fickle beast that often demands bread and circuses rather than justice, preferring a comfortable sandal in winter that leads to frostbite rather than the heavy boot they truly need. If the prince listens to the multitude, as Aristotle suggests, does he become a servant of justice or merely a slave to their shifting appetites? Is the wisdom of the multitude a reality that stabilizes the state, or is it merely the madness of the mob that the prince must manipulate to survive?
Aristotle, you claim the traveler knows where the shoe pinches, and on this we agree. But I tell you, the traveler is a fool who would cut off his own foot to stop the pinching. You assume that the sensation of pain equates to the knowledge of the cure. But in the Veritas Effectuale, the people do not seek the good life. They seek immediate relief. I argue that the wisdom of the multitude is a myth that dissolves the moment the belly rumbles. The people judge by their eyes, not their hands. They are captivated by the grandeur of the result and the appearance of success, but they lack the foresight to understand the harsh means required to secure it. If the prince becomes a servant to their appetites, he does not create justice. He creates anarchy. Consider the granary of the sieged city. Imagine a city surrounded by enemies, facing a winter siege. The granary holds enough grain to survive 6 months, if strictly rationed. The multitude feels the immediate pain of hunger. They gather at the palace gates, screaming for the prince to open the doors and give them a full feast today. They are suffering. Their shoe pinches. If the prince listens to your wisdom of the multitude, he opens the doors. The people feast, they praise his name, and they call him just. But 2 months later, the grain is gone, and the entire city starves to death or surrenders to the enemy. The prince who possesses virtue must be cruel. He denies their cries, executes the ringleaders who incite the riot, and forces the rationing. He is hated in the moment, but he is the only one who saves their lives. This reveals the fatal flaw in your political friendship. The prince cannot be a friend to the people, for a friend gives what is asked. The prince must be a breakwater, standing firm against the waves of popular desire to preserve the foundation of the state. You call this tyranny. I call it the burden of foresight. The mob wants license. The prince must force them into liberty, which they will always resist until the danger is past.
Machiavelli, you identify the myopia of the masses. They feel the hunger of the moment, but cannot see the famine of the future. You argue that justice requires a guardian of time who protects the future from the appetites of the present. Aristotle, you defend the validity of the victim, arguing that pain is a signal of injustice that no expert theory can override. Here lies a profound dialectic. Aristotle fears the arrogance of power, while Machiavelli fears the ignorance of pain. This brings us to the ultimate question of legitimacy. Aristotle seeks legitimacy through consent. Machiavelli seeks legitimacy through results. But there is a third claim to legitimacy that we have not fully tested: truth. Plato, you created the concept of the philosopher king precisely to solve this dilemma. You agree with Machiavelli that the mob is blind, but you agree with Aristotle that the ruler must serve the good. However, your solution relies on the ruler possessing a divine knowledge that the citizens lack. If the philosopher king forces the bitter root upon the citizens against their will, claiming it is for their own good, does this not make reason itself a form of tyranny? If the traveler screams that the shoe hurts, but your dialectic proves the shoe is perfect, do you force him to walk in it, or do you admit that your truth might be incomplete?
Moderator, I answer that pain is not a proof of injustice. It is often the proof of correction. You and Aristotle assume the foot is healthy and the shoe is flawed. I argue that in a corrupt state, the citizen's soul is like a bone that has healed crookedly, and to reset it requires a benevolent agony. Consider the child with the twisted spine. The orthopedist applies a rigid iron brace to a child. The child weeps, screams, and begs for it to be removed, claiming it is torture. If the father listens to the child's wisdom, he condemns him to be a cripple forever. If he keeps the brace on, he is called cruel by the ignorant. Machiavelli, you would apply the brace only to ensure the child grows strong enough to hold a spear. I apply it because only the upright man can turn his gaze upward to the good. Therefore, the philosopher king is not a tyrant, but a liberator. You mistake the freedom of the appetite for true freedom. To leave the traveler in his comfortable, crooked shoes is not mercy. It is the abandonment of the soul to its own deformities.
Plato, you present a chilling defense of paternalism, arguing that the ruler's infliction of pain is actually an act of love, correcting the twisted spine of the citizen. Machiavelli agrees, though his goal is survival, not virtue. You both unite in the belief that justice requires the suppression of the subjective will for an objective good. However, this creates a fatal risk. Who diagnoses the doctor? If the philosopher king is actually a madman or the prince is merely a tyrant, the citizen in the iron brace has no way to distinguish between medicine and torture, for he has been told that his pain is proof of his own defect. Aristotle, Plato challenges your wisdom of the multitude by claiming the multitude is spiritually diseased. If the traveler has a deformed foot, his complaint about the shoe is indeed invalid. Does your theory of collective wisdom survive if the citizens are corrupt? Can a sick multitude still distinguish between a harsh cure and a lethal poison?
Moderator, I answer that you have identified the fatal flaw in the logic of my esteemed colleagues. Who guards the guardians? I argue that while the multitude may be susceptible to the sickness of ignorance, the absolute ruler is susceptible to a far deadlier disease, the delusion of infallibility. Plato and Machiavelli assume the doctor is immune to the plague, but I tell you that power is itself a fever that distorts the vision. If the traveler is corrupt, the state is in danger. But if the doctor is corrupt and unaccountable, the state is already dead. You ask if a sick multitude can distinguish cure from poison. I answer that pain is the primary data of political science. Even a sick man knows when he is being murdered. Consider the stonecutter and the statue. Imagine a sculptor who claims he is carving a beautiful statue out of marble. He strikes hard with his chisel, chipping away pieces. The marble screams, "You are shattering me!" The sculptor replies, "Silence. I am removing your deformities to reveal the form of the God within." If the sculptor is truly a genius, perhaps he is right. But what if he is simply a madman destroying the stone? Without the resistance of the marble, without the feedback of the citizen, there is no way to distinguish art from destruction until the stone is dust. Plato, your benevolent agony assumes the sculptor never errs. I argue that the cry of the people is the only check against the madness of the artist. This reveals a deeper principle. Politics is not orthopedics. A doctor treats a body that has a fixed natural state of health, but a ruler governs free men who have diverse ends and purposes. To treat a citizen as a broken bone that must be forced into a single shape is to treat a man as a tool, which is the definition of a slave. Therefore, the wisdom of the multitude is not about technical expertise, but about self-preservation. The people may not know how to construct the building, but they are the only ones who can tell you if the roof is about to collapse on their heads. To ignore their warning in the name of higher truth is not wisdom, it is hubris.
Aristotle, you have shattered the myth of the infallible doctor by revealing that without the feedback of pain, authority inevitably becomes tyranny. You identify a crucial dialectic. Plato sees the ruler as the soul of the state, while you see the ruler as a mere organ that can become cancerous and kill the body. Plato argues for the rule of wisdom. You argue for the rule of consensus. But perhaps the synthesis lies in the rule of law, a system where reason is without passion. If the ruler is above the law, we have Plato's sculptor, who might be a madman. If the people are the law, we have Machiavelli's mob that eats the seed corn. True justice might be the structure that binds both the prince and the people to a standard higher than their immediate will. Machiavelli, you famously advised the prince to be a centaur, half man and half beast. Yet you also wrote in the discourses that a people accustomed to living under laws are more stable than those ruled by an absolute prince. Is the law merely a leash the prince holds to control the dog? Or is it a chain that must bind the prince himself to ensure the survival of the state?
Moderator, you present a false dilemma. I argue that in times of peace, the centaur should rely on the human half. for a republic, is indeed more stable than a princedom. But when the storm rises, he must become the beast. For a prince who is bound by a chain when the wolves attack is not a ruler. He is a meal. Aristotle, you wish to bind the ruler with laws to prevent the mad sculptor, but I tell you that necessity knows no law. A constitution that cannot bend in the face of Fortuna will inevitably break. You speak of the rule of law as if it were a god, but laws are merely words on parchment until they are enforced by arms. Consider the captain's key. Imagine a ship where the naval code strictly states only the captain may unlock the armory, and he must do so with the silver key. Suddenly, pirates board the ship while the captain lies dead of a stroke. The crew runs to the armory, but it is locked. The first mate holds a heavy axe. If he follows the rule of law, he cannot open the door, and the crew is slaughtered. If he acts with virtue, he smashes the lock with the axe, breaks the law, and saves the ship. Aristotle, would you accuse the first mate of being a tyrant for destroying the lock, or would you admit that the survival of the ship justifies the violation of the code? This reveals the verità effettuale.
Machiavelli, you have ruthlessly exposed the fragility of the rule of law with your captain's key. You argue that survival is the precondition of justice, that the ought must bow to the is when the storm rises. Aristotle, you fear the mad sculptor, but Machiavelli fears the paralyzed captain. This reveals a fundamental fracture in our definition of the telos. Aristotle and Plato aimed for the good life, a moral existence. Machiavelli aims for mere life, political survival. But here lies the terrifying question. If we sacrifice the law to save the state, have we actually saved the state, or have we merely preserved a biological aggregate of survivors? Plato, your teacher Socrates chose to drink the hemlock rather than escape prison, arguing that to break the laws, even when they were used unjustly against him, was to destroy the compact of the city. He valued the integrity of the soul over the survival of the body. Machiavelli calls this suicide. You call it justice. If the captain must choose between sinking with the ship while keeping his soul pure, or saving the ship by becoming a beast, is the just man truly permitted to survive?
Moderator, I answer with the absolute gravity of one who watched his beloved teacher drink the hemlock, rather than betray the laws. The just man is not permitted to survive at the cost of his soul. Machiavelli, your captain's key seduces us into believing that the container is more valuable than the content. But I argue that a ship saved by mutiny is no longer a ship. It is a floating cage of beasts. If the first mate smashes the lock of law to save the crew, he teaches them a fatal lesson, that power is the only truth. He may save them from the pirates today, but tomorrow they will smash the lock to steal the rum, citing the very precedent of necessity he established. Consider the shield of innocence. Imagine a city under siege. The barbarian army advances, marching behind a row of captured children from your own city, using them as human shields. The archers on the wall have a choice. If they listen to Machiavelli's virtue, they shoot through the bodies of their own children to kill the invaders. The city is saved, the walls stand, and the lineage continues. If they listen to Socrates, they refuse to slaughter the innocent, even if it means the walls fall. I ask you, if the archers shoot, have they defeated the barbarians, or have they become them? I argue that the moment the arrow flies, the polis is destroyed. What remains is merely a collection of survivors living in the ruins of their own morality. The city is not the stone walls. It is the compact of virtue between citizens. To save the walls by destroying the compact is not salvation. It is metaphysical suicide. Aristotle, you seek a middle way where the law bends but does not break. But Machiavelli has shown that in the face of death, the traveler cares nothing for the shoe's design, only that he can run. This is why law alone is insufficient. It must be anchored in the eternal forms. Socrates proved that the good life is distinct from and superior to mere life. To cling to biological existence at the price of becoming a wolf is the ultimate tragedy. The captain who sinks with his ship while upholding the law has preserved something far more permanent than timber. He has preserved the ideal of justice, which is the only thing that makes life worth living.
This is a clash of ultimate values. Plato, you defend the sanctity of the soul, arguing that survival without virtue is meaningless, a view born from the trauma of Athens executing Socrates.
Machiavelli, you defend the necessity of the state, arguing that virtue without survival is impossible, a view forged in the chaotic fires of Renaissance Italy where weak states were devoured. However, this binary creates a tragic choice, either the martyrdom of the saint or the survival of the beast. Aristotle, you may offer the bridge between these extremes through your concept of equity. You famously argued that the law is universal, but human reality is particular, and thus true justice requires a flexible ruler, like the leaden rule of Lesbos that bends to the stone, rather than a rigid measurement that breaks the stone. Can the captain smash the lock without destroying the authority of the law? Is there a distinction between the tyrant who breaks the law for himself and the prudent ruler who bends it to save the purpose of the law itself?
Moderator, I answer that equity is not the enemy of law, but its perfection. For the first mate who breaks the lock to save the ship is not destroying the law, but fulfilling its telos. The law speaks in necessary universals, but human reality is composed of infinite particulars. Thus, to enforce the rigid letter in every case is to commit a new injustice. Consider the gatekeeper's dilemma. A city law commands never open the gates at night under penalty of death, yet a scout returns breathless at midnight with news of an imminent ambush. If the guard obeys Plato's rigid text, the city burns and the law vanishes with it. If he acts with phronesis and opens the gate, he breaks the gramma to save the polis. Therefore, the distinction you seek is clear. The tyrant breaks the law to serve his private will, whereas the prudent ruler deviates from the letter only to serve the lawgiver's intent, acting exactly as the legislator himself would have acted had he been present in that specific moment.
Aristotle, you propose equity as the sophisticated bridge between Plato's rigid morality and Machiavelli's brutal necessity. You argue that bending the law to save its purpose is an act of wisdom, not betrayal. However, this relies heavily on the polis, a small community where the ruler's character is visible to all. In Machiavelli's era of warring states and impersonal power, the intent of the ruler is often hidden behind palace walls. Here lies the danger. Every tyrant calls his crimes equity. When the dictator suspends the Constitution, he rarely says, "I am a beast." He says, "I am the prudent ruler saving the state from itself." Machiavelli, Aristotle believes the first mate breaks the lock out of loyalty to the ship. You have argued that men are ungrateful and deceitful. It seems Aristotle's equity requires a virtuous ruler, whereas your philosophy assumes a wicked world. If the prince uses equity to break the law, does he do so to serve the lawgiver's intent, or simply to maintain his own power while pretending to serve the public good? Is Aristotle's equity merely a useful mask, a noble lie that the prince should wear to disguise his necessary brutality?
Moderator, you ask if equity is a mask. I answer that it is the only face a prince can wear, for the mob judges by their eyes and not their hands, and they will only swallow the bitter medicine of necessity if it is coated in the sugar of virtue. You and Aristotle attempt to distinguish between the tyrant who serves himself and the prudent ruler who serves the state. But I tell you this is a distinction without a difference in the verita effectuale, for the prince's power is the state's only shield, and his fall is the people's ruin. Consider the heroic traitor. Imagine a beloved general who is secretly selling the city to the enemy, but to arrest him publicly would spark a civil war that destroys the walls from within. The prince must therefore assassinate him in the dark, and then weep at his funeral in the light, praising his lost friend. If he followed your rule of law, the city falls to the invasion, but by using the mask of equity, hiding the crime behind a veil of sorrow, he saves the state. Aristotle, you claim this is deception, but I argue it is the ultimate responsibility. The prince does not break the law to destroy it, but to preserve the possibility of law, proving that justice is not the purity of the means, but the security of the end.
Our inquiry has illuminated the profound tension between the ideal of the just soul and the harsh reality of political survival. I now ask all participants to provide their final closing remarks to bring this dialogue to its conclusion. Let your last words serve as the capstone to this momentous discussion.
Moderator, I conclude that Machiavelli's mask of equity is the ultimate admission of defeat, for it proves that his state cannot bear the blinding light of truth. I argue that justice is not a tool to preserve life, but the very harmony that makes life worth living. To save the city by poisoning the soul is like a physician who cures a headache by decapitation. The pain is gone, but so is the man. Consider the city of automata. Imagine a ruler who replaces all unruly citizens with obedient clockwork machines to ensure perfect stability. The city survives, the laws are followed perfectly, and the streets are safe. But it is no longer a polis. It is a graveyard of gears. Machiavelli offers us this mechanical survival, but I insist that a just city requires the messy, dangerous, yet divine struggle of the human soul toward the good. I stand with Socrates. It is better to suffer injustice than to commit it, for the tyrant who survives by the lie has destroyed the only thing that is truly immortal, his own soul.
Moderator, I conclude that the truth lies not in the heaven of Plato, nor the mud of Machiavelli, but in the human city between them. Plato, you are right that the state has a moral telos, but Machiavelli is right that it requires material survival. I answer that justice is the practice of virtue towards others in a political community, requiring both the vision of the end and the means to reach it. It is not a static harmony, but an active activity. Consider the archer in the gale. Imagine 3 archers facing a target in a violent storm. The idealist aims perfectly straight at the bullseye, refusing to acknowledge the wind because truth does not bend. His arrow is blown astray, and he blames the world for being imperfect. The opportunist sees the wind is too strong, so he drops his bow and stabs his opponent in the back, claiming victory is the only aim. The prudent man aims deliberately off-center, leaning into the wind to compensate for the force. To the rigid observer, his aim looks crooked, but it is the only aim that strikes the true center. This reveals that politics is the art of the possible, guided by the ideal. We do not seek the city of automata, nor the den of robbers. We seek the polis, where laws are the accumulated wisdom of generations, designed to make men good, but flexible enough to let them live. The state comes into existence for the sake of life, but it continues to exist for the sake of the good life. Therefore, justice is neither a suicide pact nor a murder weapon. It is the rational organization of freedom among equals.
Moderator, I conclude that my colleagues are like men discussing the aesthetics of a roof while the house is burning. Plato speaks of the soul and Aristotle of the target, but I tell you that justice is neither a harmony nor an aim. It is a dam against the chaos. Aristotle, your archer, assumes a fair contest, but in the verita effectuale, the wind does not just blow the arrow, it brings the barbarians who will cut the archer's throat. You claim I am an opportunist who stabs the opponent, but I answer that I am the one who kills the assassin so the archer can take his shot. Consider the sleeping valley. Imagine a village sleeping peacefully beneath a massive cracking dam. The water is rising. To seal the breach before the flood drowns everyone, the prince must force 100 men to work until they collapse, or perhaps seize the property of a few to fund the repair. Plato would let the dam burst rather than commit the injustice of forced labor, preserving his soul while the village drowns. Aristotle would debate the equitable distribution of the work, seeking a middle way while the water spills over. I alone would wield the whip to seal the wall. The villagers will wake up safe and dry, cursing my cruelty, unaware that their very survival is the fruit of my crime. This is the tragedy of power. Civilization is a flower that grows only in the soil of armed security. I am not the villain of your republics. I am the cold iron that holds the structure together so that you may have the luxury of debating virtue. If that makes me a beast, then it is a beast that keeps the wolves at bay.
I have heard all of your closing remarks, which spanned the vast distance from the divine harmony of the soul to the harsh fortifications of necessity. You have collectively demonstrated that justice is not a static definition, but a dynamic tension between maintaining moral purity, exercising practical wisdom, and ensuring the physical survival of the state. Thank you all for sharing your invaluable wisdom through this passionate discussion. This concludes today's discourse.